Greetings all. It's been a little while since I've done one of these response videos, so I thought I should enter the fray once again and respond to this video, which well, I mean, it's a couple of months old now. When was it released? I've been meaning to... the hell? I've been meaning to get to this one for... Oh, it was only about a month ago. Okay, yeah, so I've been meaning to get to this, but you know how things are. This is a fairly long and, let's say, technical video on Capturing Christianity about why theism is a good explanation. It attempts to set out a framework for how it is that theism is able to, well, explain stuff about the world, and you know why theism has the explanatory resources in order to defend, in order to be able to defend itself as a worldview. Because it's such a long video, I'm not going to be able to go through the entirety of it. I may skip around a bit. Some of it is very technical and unclear to me it's unclear exactly what they are saying in parts. But anyway, I thought it was interesting, so let's take a look.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we get started on the presentation?
Not really. I mean, I guess the basic point is we're not presenting a new argument. We're not necessarily, it's not like this is a new argument or this is, we just dug this up the other day. This is more of a framework of how to look at theistic evidence and how we can take the evidence we have and incorporate it into an explanatory framework. So that's what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah, so this is, it's not going to be like a new argument for the existence of God. This is more of just a way of understanding how theism can operate as an explanation. And along the way, it'll address some objections that you may have seen from certain atheists online, and there's also a section at the very end of the presentation where they cover objections. And in that section, you can kind of see how their framework that they build is going to easily respond to some of these objections that get thrown out sometimes.
Easily.
So, all right, let's go ahead and just jump into the presentation. I'll pull up the scene. Whenever you guys are ready, just take it away. And just a quick reminder to both of you guys that I will be adjusting the slides manually. So when you want to advance to the next one, just let me know and I'll do it on my end.
All right, no problem, Cam. So we agreed I'll start off the presentation and then we'll switch over to Tim once we get to his section. So next, start off first slide. So today we're going to be going over, this is the main outline of this presentation. So number 1 is epistemic probability. Number 2 is the axiology framework and background knowledge. Number 3 is the actual evidence for theism itself. And then number 4 is just answering some objections. So this is the outline of the entire presentation. Next slide. So first, let's start off with epistemic probability. So next slide. So epistemic probability is defined as a degree to which one proposition makes another likely. Now, there are two main types of epistemic probability. The first one is what's called non-basic probabilities. So these are the probabilities that are determined by the values of other probabilities. And then you have what's called basic probabilities, which is like sort of like the foundation of probability theory. So Devin Kalamahanga, he's a probabilistic philosopher. He says that basic probabilities are basically the elementary quantities out of which other probabilities are built, or they're the atoms of probability theory. So there's great what probabilities are basic. And the second question asks, how are the values of these basic probabilities determined? Now, for the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on the first one specifically. So which probabilities are basic? So next slide. So there's two views about which probabilities are basic. So the first view is what's called orthodox Bayesianism. And on orthodox Bayesianism, the basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of. And so if you accept this view of probability theory, you would say that the intrinsic world is...
Sorry, Kyle, kind of cut out a little bit.
Okay, yeah. So orthodox Bayesianism would basically say that basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds. And so on this view, then you would sort of entail that the intrinsic probability of the world is the total number of claims it makes. So typically, this is cashed out in terms of modesty and coherence. And of course, finally, on orthodox Bayesianism, only some probabilities are conditional. So not all probabilities are going to be conditional in this view because you can have some what's called unconditional probabilities. Now, in case the audience is not aware, an unconditional probability is basically any probability that's not conditional evidence, right? So you don't have evidence that you look at, but rather you just look at the hypothesis itself, right? Now, it's a little bit different on explanationism because on explanationism, basic probabilities are the probabilities of atomic propositions conditional on potential direct explanations, right? So on this view, the prior probability or even intrinsic probability is going to be determined by higher order theories. And on this view, all probabilities are conditional. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is going to be sort of like a defense against some objections that might come up later. So the reason why we're sort of laying out these two views is to just show that if you're going to make an objection to our presentation later on based on orthodox Bayesianism, well, we don't accept orthodox Bayesianism. We hold to an explanationist view of Bayesianism, right? So in explanationism, the intrinsic probability of a world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains and how well they are able to explain all of the other propositions which the world contains. So in this sort of view of probability, it's not about the number of claims that a hypothesis makes that makes it more or less likely, but rather it's about the relationships between propositions and how one proposition can explain another proposition, right? So it doesn't matter how many propositions your worldview has, right? But rather what's going to matter is how well are your propositions able to explain other propositions. So that's basically the idea. And the reason why I sort of, we propose this view is because this will, again, as I said earlier, this is going to really bypass a lot of the objections that come up later. So you can go to the next slide. So these are some of the advantages to explanationism. Now, I'm not going to get into every...
Yes, I'm playing this part because I think that it's important for some of the things that they say later. This point here about, well, it doesn't actually say it on the slide, but his point about the number of propositions not being important is going to come into play later when it comes to like talking about omnipotence. I'm not sure I understand the connection between what he's saying here about explanationism and the idea that the number of propositions doesn't matter. Because the idea of the quality, because what he said about the quality of an explanation is that you want to establish how well you can account for the explanator, the thing that you're trying to explain, given the postulates that you start with. And under any credible theory of explanation, you want to minimize the number of those postulates. So it seems like it does matter how many. I mean, it's not strictly the number of propositions in terms of, counting them, but the more assumptions you have to make, then the weaker the explanation becomes. I mean, I don't see any conflict between what he said here and that point, but I think this may come up later. So let me just flag that and we'll keep going.
Manga, it's called The Structure of Epistemic Probabilities, and these are kind of the 5 main arguments he gives in this paper. So the first advantage is that conditional probabilities of atomic propositions may be well defined when associated unconditional state descriptions. Probabilities are not.
I think we can skip.
The second one is the probabilities.
We don't want to get distracted
relations between propositions, which is
let's jump back a little bit here.
Are like arguments in support of the explanationist view over the orthodox view. I don't know if Tim has anything else to add, but I think it's his turn to.
Nope, that's good. Yeah, we can go to the next one. Okay, yeah, so now we can discuss how we are viewing epistemic probabilities, because there are many different views of epistemic probabilities. And so a lot of the work that we're citing is leaning on Nevin Clemenhaga's work. And in 2022, he released a paper on the degree of support interpretation of epistemic probability, which is basically the fact that probabilities, or epistemic probabilities for short, are mind-independent support relations between propositions, which is, if you want to know what the probability of A given B is, it's just simply the degree to which B supports A and the unconditional probability of A as the degree to which A is supported by a priori truths or tautologies. And so this idea is that we have these degree of support relations, and in the past, epistemic probabilities have not been seen in terms of degrees of support, but in terms of degrees of belief, or subjective degrees of belief. And so what Nevin is trying to do with this is he's trying to get to more of what can be seen as a maybe quasi-logical probability in a kind of propositional calculus, where basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, like, what is the actual support relations between these propositions, and how are we able to see their degree of confirmation, which is ultimately what a probability is. And so that's ultimately going to help us when we're doing our comparative analysis against other theories. Coming with this understanding of epistemic probability, this is going to provide the groundwork and the ground understanding for how we are actually assigning probabilities, how we are actually grounding our probabilities. So we also take the positive relevance view of evidence. And so the positive relevance view of evidence is defined as E is evidence for H, if and only if the probability of H given E is greater than the probability of H. That is, if and only if E raises the probability of H above what it was when E was not taken into account. So that's Roche 2003, defending that against objections. And so a lot of probabilists and a lot of evidentialists hold to a positive relevance view of evidence, that evidence is probability raising. Not all evidentialists and not all philosophers of probability and philosophers of evidence agree with this view, but this view, I'm not going to go into doing a full-blown defense of it here. There's going to be a lot of programmatic assumptions going into this, but we do think that this view coheres very well with explanationism and the degree of support interpretation of epistemic probability. And so when we're thinking about evidence, this is exactly how we're defining it, and it's a very clear analytic manner. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the axiological framework and background knowledge. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so background knowledge. If you're familiar with Swinburne, he lays out 4 explanatory criteria, and one of those is background knowledge. And if you also know, is Swinburne actually reduces background knowledge in his work, in his defense of God's existence, to actually simplicity. Now, he's been critiqued by other philosophers of science and atheist philosophers for doing that. And they actually think that there is an argument that can be said that we should actually keep background knowledge when we can. Background knowledge is important. It's a way that we can actually ground probabilities. If we're comparing 2 theories and one fits with background knowledge and the other one doesn't, the one that fits with background knowledge is going to be more probable because it's already meshing with inquiry and other places of knowledge that we understand. So this criterion assesses whether the postulated explanation meshes with other explanations. So an explanation fits with background knowledge if the causes or entities invoked by the explanation are similar to those causes or entities that are taken to exist within other neighboring fields. And so if you think about, we don't postulate fairies in physics, or we don't postulate fairies in biology to explain, let's say, unobservable phenomena. One of those reasons is, well, it just simply doesn't fit with background knowledge. Not even taking an explanation into account. It's not being postulated in other neighboring fields. It's not being postulated in metaphysics or ontology. It's not being postulated in theoretical physics. But what are being postulated in these other areas are atoms or particles or fundamental particles. And so particle as a type is being invoked. And it doesn't really matter what the tokens are when it comes to background knowledge. All it matters is if the type is being invoked in another neighboring field.
Yeah, so they mentioned the type and token distinction. I don't think they explain it. So the difference in philosophy between a type and a token is basically, I was going to say it's a type of something that's not entirely helpful. Yeah, it's like a sort of a thing, like a particle or maybe maybe an electron, or I don't know that that's actually the best example. I don't know, a species perhaps. Any particular example is going to be a bit controversial. The difference between a type and a token is that a token is a particular instantiation of a type. You know, so a type might be like humans, and a token would be a particular human being, or a type might be a form of a proposition, and then a token would be a particular instantiation of that proposition when you utter a sentence or when a sentence is written somewhere or something. So, yeah, that's the distinction between types and tokens. It's basically like, think of it sort of like as sets and elements of a set or something like that.
So we can go to the next slide. So this is important because it's often been said by other atheist philosophers such as Hume, Sobel, and Mackey that, well, theism just does not fit with that.
Yeah, okay, so this is where it gets a little bit crazy. Yeah, so here they introduce a trope theory of theism, which I've not heard of before, and won't pretend to understand. I did look up the paper that they mentioned, and I didn't find that any more illuminating. I didn't read the whole thing, but I looked at the relevant section. So, yeah, this is very odd. I might try to explain it in my own words rather than play all of what they say here, because I don't know how essential this is to their argument. I want to get some stuff. I want to get to some things that they talk about later on, which is what I'm primarily interested in, but I want to present this in case it's sort of relevant, because I'm still not entirely sure how all aspects of their case fit together. But what they're going to say here is that, look, they don't want to say that God is something that is kind of unknown, like a different type of entity, because that's not going to be very plausible. So instead, that they're going to describe God in terms of some entity that is postulated in like relevant fields, and the particular entity that they're going with is a trope. So a trope is a concept in, I guess, metaphysics. The best I can do of explaining what a trope is that a trope is an instantiated property. So traditionally in metaphysics, there's a distinction between substances and properties. A substance is like a thing. It could be, I don't know, water, or a field, or a type of matter or something, or even an immaterial substance, if you believe in such things, right? So yeah, a substance is like a type of thing. And then you can token that substance, I suppose, with like particular objects or whatever. A property is an aspect of a substance. So it could be like mass, or maybe location, or electric charge, or whether it's good or bad, or color, different properties that you can like predicate of a substance or of an object that instantiates that substance. So I might have a glass of water. The water in that glass is, you could call that an object, or at least an amount of a substance, which is the water. And then that water will have different properties, like its temperature and its color and so forth, right? So, that's a very crude explanation of substance property. Now, the idea of a trope is that it sort of blends the two, right? So a trope is not a property. Properties are supposed to be able to be exemplified in different objects. So you can have two different substances or different objects that are the same color, the property being multiply exemplified in different objects. Tropes are not supposed to be like that. So tropes are concrete in that they are instantiated like in a particular a token, like in one place or one object. But they're not substances either, because they sort of have a property characteristic as well. So they're often described as like property instances. So a trope is like the redness of a particular apple, not red in general, and not the apple. It's the redness of that apple, or the sound of this particular person speaking at this time, or the mass of this particular car or whatever. Right, so that's at least my understanding of what a trope is. It's a property instance, or an instantiation of a property at a particular sort of point in time space. I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be in time space, but anyway. So people have introduced tropes into metaphysics to try to make sense of various paradoxes, most of which, in my view, I think are verbal rather than substantial, but that is another issue entirely. So what they're doing in this video is they're going to say that God is a trope. So he's a property instance. Not a bundle of property instances, by the way, just a trope, or a module trope. And don't ask me what a module trope is, because I don't know, and I don't think they explain. They're going to say that God is a trope, specifically the omnipotence trope. So they're going to say that God is ultimately simple because he is that single trope. He doesn't have any parts. because like I guess tropes don't have parts; they're just like an instantiated property. There's aspects of that trope which you can see in the diagram: the omniscience aspect, omnipresence aspect, freedom aspect, goodness aspect, and so forth. I don't know why those are aspects of omnipotence. I don't know that if they explain that. I don't quite know how you can say that a trope, like a single trope, is ultimately simple if it has distinct aspects, but which are then also the same as each other. These aspects are supposed to be numerically identical, which is what those double arrows indicate, and it mentions that in the paper. I don't know how different things can be numerically identically to each other, but apparently they can. So, I mean, I guess you're getting that. I don't really understand how this is supposed to work. Now, the fact that I don't understand it is not necessarily an argument against it, but I think that it at least is incumbent on those who advocate a position like this to perhaps try to articulate in a little bit more clear terms as to what they're trying to say here and how it is that things that seem pretty darn different, like omnipresence and freedom, can be in fact numerically identical to each other and simultaneously aspects of the omnipotence trope. So anyway, that's my understanding of what they're saying, and some of my concern that I really think that it's kind of incoherent, or at least they haven't convinced me that it is coherent. Let me play a little bit more and just see,
knowledge, like
get a little bit more
if
out
you're
of
positing
this.
God as a
Because this is going to be important later, right? Because basically they're going to say that God is ultimately simple and so is a good explanation, and they ground that in terms of this omnipotence trope. But they don't really convince me that they or anyone else has any clue what the nature of this omnipotence trope is, or why we should accept that it's ultimately simple.
Body mind, or a bodiless spirit
Yes, I've already said
connected to
that.
bodies. And so the idea here is that it doesn't really track well with our experience, and it's not even really being postulated in other fields of inquiry. And so
Yes,
thus God actually
that's a claim that atheists make, that you can't just, well, it's implausible to postulate an immaterial mind or bodiless spirit because we never postulate that elsewhere. So they're trying to get around that by instead postulating an omnipotence trope. Now, I'm not quite sure how. Oh, yeah, sorry. I was going to say, well, they claim that tropes are something that we postulate elsewhere, which is true. Other philosophers do postulate tropes, although I don't know about this module trope, but maybe we'll hear more about that.
Knowledge. And so therefore, on a fundamentality and explanation and existence of God, I forget the really, really long one, but he actually finds a way for us to salvage background knowledge by not viewing God as a bodiless spirit or a disembodied mind, but rather we can view God as a trope as defined in trope theory. And if we view God as a trope, then tropes actually allows us to maintain background knowledge. We don't actually have to reduce it to anything else. We actually can keep the criterion of background knowledge. And I think it's actually rational that we ought to want to keep it when we can, because we do that with other explanations. And so if God fits with background knowledge by being a trope, what that means is that tropes are actually being invoked in other fields of inquiry. And so contemporary metaphysicians and ontologists are actually finding tropes to actually be a very advantageous way to look at things. They can do everything universals can without the baggage of universals. And so they actually allow us to do a lot of the work that we've always been wanting to do without actually tacking on certain other commitments. And so there's a lot of advantageous reasons to adopt tropes. And so there's actually a whole book called like the Ontology of Quantum Field Theory. And there's 4 chapters in that book dedicated to trope ontology and actually having a trope ontology view of quantum field theory. And so tropes are being invoked left and right within philosophy and other neighboring fields of inquiry as explanations. And so if God is a trope, remember the type trope, God would be a token of a trope. There are different other kinds of tropes. And so it doesn't really matter what the tokens are. Like I said, it matters what the type is. And so if the type trope fits with background knowledge, then God satisfies that fitting with background knowledge. And so the idea here is that God would then be defined as an omnipotence module trope being a trope that is self-exemplifying. It instantiates itself as a property. It doesn't really have properties, or rather it is identical, numerically identical to the properties that it has. And so you can see the double arrow there, the biconditional arrow there, that
You see, I don't think tropes have properties, right? The whole point is to get around that notion, like distinction between substance and properties. I mean, I don't pretend to understand this especially well myself. I've read a little bit about trope theory, but I find it all a bit bizarre, to be honest. Trying to explain these sorts of conundrums, metaphysical conundrums in terms of made up ideas that are very hard to really catch out in anything very concrete. I mean, I suppose that does happen in science sometimes, but at least you have to often describe it fairly precisely and then show experimental predictions and so forth. But anyway, I mean, I don't want to say that trope theory is completely wrong-headed. I'm just a bit skeptical. But I think one of the issues here is I don't really know how appealing to a trope is getting you anywhere, because a trope is just a fundamental ontological category, right? Traditionally, I think it's more traditional to describe God perhaps as a substance or an object. I mean, I'm not even exactly sure, but I mean, the point is that those are familiar ontological categories. Like whatever category you pick, those are all familiar. The issue is not that God is a substance or an object or a person or something. It's rather his other the other aspects of him, like being bodiless and a mind, or being omnipresent, for example. These are the sorts of things that create issues. It's not the fact that of the type of ontological category he is, unless you introduce a whole new one, I suppose. So merely saying, well, we're going to say that God is a trope, I just don't know. Like, you know, maybe trope theory is the correct way to understand quantum field theory, but does that really increase the prior plausibility? Does that increase the plausibility of a God trope or like an omnipotence trope existing? I don't see how, because they're so substantively different. You know, like none of these aspects that they're postulating of the omnipotence trope would have any corollaries in quantum field theory. Just like I don't think it's plausible to say that we can postulate God as a bodiless spirit or an immaterial mind, even though, you know, we know that we exist as minds, because of all of the dramatic differences between God as an immaterial mind versus us as, you know, finite, embodied, imperfect minds. So it's not the ontological category that's the issue here. It's what you might call aspects, properties, or other components of like the specifics of the God hypothesis, regardless of what ontological category that you put it into. So I don't really know that this is getting us anywhere. At least it doesn't seem to me that this is getting us anywhere, because I have the same objections about the omnipotence trope that I do about like a bodiless spirit or an immaterial mind or something else. I've got a question here from Obiter Dicta. I personally found I'm James. So Obiter Dicta personally found Luke Barnes's verses of John spontaneously forming the stars a strong counterexample that theism can have no explanatory power. Any further reflections? It's unclear how naturalism would be superior in that example. Yeah, this is brought up later. That's a good question. This is brought up later on in this video, or a similar example. Luke Barnes brought that up in his debate with me. I can't remember exactly what I said. I've had more time to think about that since then. And I think the best response is simply to say that theists, when they put examples like that, welcome Git and others as well, I think the best response is when theists put forward an example like that, they normally just sort of assume that theism has explanatory power with respect to that situation. So if, you know, verses of John formed in the stars, or we observed that would be evidence for theism, or at least that theism would be able to account for that better than naturalism. I've never heard an account that attempts to explain that. And I think that this is the problem, actually, that then this is similar with resurrection and with fine-tuning and everything else. It seems to me that essentially all of the benefit that theism gets is by appeals to intuitions, which as soon as you start to articulate them, kind of fall apart. So let's break that down. Why is it expected under theism? I think this is something like what I said to Luke Barnes. Why is it expected under theism that we would observe the stars forming shapes of John, like verses from John? Why is that expected? What principles of theism are we appealing to here? Like, what underlying postulates can we appeal to that make it reasonable to think that something like that would happen? Because theists, like, they never say that anything like that's going to happen. It seems entirely as ad hoc as anything else that you could postulate. I don't see how theism has an explanation with respect to that. Now, naturalism doesn't have an obvious candidate either. I think the best explanation for something like that would probably be some sort of alien species playing a trick on us for a weird sort of joke, which isn't a very good explanation, but is probably the best available. I don't know how that's worse than postulating that God wanted to do it for an unspecified reason. Like, you might have said, well, you know, God might want to show that he exists by putting a cosmological sign of something else that connects to, you know, his work on Earth. But I mean, would he? Like, why would you think that? That doesn't seem very consistent with anything else that he's ever done. Like, he's never done anything like this before, given cosmological signs. And I mean, why would he give cosmological signs like this now and not previous in history? Why wouldn't he have set up the world such that these sorts of things weren't necessary, and it was that there were signs throughout, or you know, other types of evidences that I've talked about in the past? Like, I guess what I want is an articulation of why that is expected under theism more than under naturalism. Sure, a naturalist explanation is not going to be very good. It's going to be rather ad hoc, but it seems the theist one is really no better. So I'm just not sure why that's explained under theism. And I think that this is the fundamental problem here. Theists will gesture at things and just sort of assume that those are explained without being able to cash out why that's expected under theism. Particularly when we condition on the history of the universe up to now. Like, I mean, maybe in a different type of universe that would be expected under theism. It would be reasonable to say, well, God does these sorts of things all the time, but like God doesn't, right? So then why would he do it all of a sudden in this sort of bizarre way? Like, it doesn't really make any sense. You can, of course, you can ad hoc some sort of explanation, but then the naturalist can ad hoc some sort of explanation either. So as well. So I'm not really sure why the theist has any explanatory advantage there. But I think that some of those points will also be brought out over the course of this video too. Thanks, Git. Git Stanfield. Really appreciate your channel. Also reading a book refuting William Lane Craig, which made me think about different ways of time. Oh, different theories of time. Yeah, also defending naturalism. Keep going. Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate the donation. Let's keep going.
God defined as a trope and an omnipotence model trope is God, then that actually allows us to actually get everything we want when it comes to a robust view of theism. We can have all of the characteristics of God fit and satisfy very well trope theoretic constraints. So it does fit very well with background knowledge. You can go to the next slide.
Real quick, I just wanted to quickly mention that I've had Dr. Joshua Sijiwati on the show to talk about this. So if you'd like to search for Joshua Sijiwati, Capturing Christianity, you can find, I think we've done at least 2 or 3 shows with him where he explains this whole theory and how it all works. And when we're talking about a module trope, it's not some like imaginary abstract object. It's actually a concrete object. So yeah, it's not someone in the...
See, I haven't seen that video, so I might have to look it up to see what is being discussed here. But again, I don't really know that what they say subsequently really depends on this. So
the live chat was saying, "Congrats, you worship a trope." But yeah, that's just to misunderstand like how this is being used.
Yeah,
here.
yeah. There are debates within trope theory of whether or not you take a nominalist approach to trope theory, so it's just in name only, or there's an ontologically robust kind of view of trope theory. Either way, it is consistent with theism.
How is a nominalist conception of trope theory consistent with theism? I don't know. I guess that's above my...
Viewing God as a trope fit with those ideas, and so that's just what that means.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, so we can call this trope theoretic theism. And what this does is...
Yeah, this is what I was saying before. Thanks, MX Lexid. I don't know how to pronounce that exactly. Remember how much time theists spend trying to explain why we don't see any evidence or better evidence of theism. God just wouldn't do that sort of thing. Yet the moment such evidence appeared, they would be the first to leap on it. And that's exactly... the problem with this imaginary, like John in the stars example. They appeal to that as hypothetical evidence for theism, but yet the rest of the time they spend explaining why we don't see that sort of evidence of theism. So this is precisely the problem. Which is it? What is expected under theism? Would we expect to see evidence in the stars, or would we not? And this is my problem. It doesn't seem like there's any principled explanation for this. So yeah, John in the stars is a weird thing to try to explain under naturalism, but I think it's just as weird thing to try to explain under theism.
Is it readily gives us our theoretical content, because when it comes to any theory doing any explaining, we're starting with the theoretical content. We're starting with the propositions that it takes to actually get our theory off the ground. It takes to describe our theory, and that's ultimately what's going to give us our predictions. And so our theoretical content is there exists a single metaphysically simple omnipotence module trope. And like Cameron pointed out earlier, module tropes, unlike modifier tropes, are abstract particular natures that actually instantiate their properties in objects, right? And so objects intrinsically are bestowed these trope features, right? And so often trope theorists are bundle theorists, meaning that if you take a power view of ontology, which we will be assuming for this presentation, then
they just don't explain any of these terms that they just throw in. It really annoys me. Anyway, I might explain that in a bit. I'll just see how relevant it is.
Substances, like Aristotelian substances, are actually bundles of tropes, because these tropes are supposed to be these irreducible, simple entities. That because a trope doesn't exhaust its content, that when you bundle these tropes together, you're actually able to get a substance, and those tropes taken together unify in such a way that it bestows the powers and the properties that that object actually has, right? So if I take a brown chair, for example.
Yeah, but that can't work for God, right? You can't say that God is a bundle of tropes. God's got to be one metaphysically simple trope. So how does that, or at least according to them, so how does that work?
We can say, oh, that chair has a brown trope, but that trope doesn't exhaust the content of the chair. You still have things like weight and mass and things of that sort that it would take to, when bundled together, you get the chair. And so God would not be any kind of bundle. God would simply be irreducible, and so therefore would be metaphysically simple. You get non-compositeness, and you have attributes identical to God and to others. And so you're wondering, oh, it seems like I'm just kind of shoehorning in divine simplicity. Well, actually, trope theory, which is a really interesting consequence of trope theory, is that it's actually able to bypass Leibniz's law of indiscernibles, and it's actually able to you're actually able to have duplicates of tropes contained in the content of a single object, which is really interesting, because then it allows us to have a very analytically, metaphysically robust view of the Trinity, right? And so Sijiwati actually has a paper on this as well. And if you want to see a trope theoretic approach and an aspectivalist approach to trope theory when it comes to divine simplicity, Joshua Sijiwati has written a full paper on that, and it is what actually convinced me that a moderate view, not very radical view of divine simplicity actually is true. And so it gives us that. The reason why the properties
of
God here, not taken in the analogous sense, not taken in numerically distinct sense, would be numerically identical to one another, is because we're able to bypass Leibniz's law of indiscernibles. What we're able to have is we're able to think about these things in terms of what Donald Baxter calls aspects. That these are intrinsic self-different, qualitatively self-differing aspects of an object, right?
So they're numerically identical. So what we're talking about here is the different, well, can't say properties because he doesn't think they're properties. They're the different facets or aspects of God, right? I think this is so poorly explained. Yes, it's complicated stuff, but they don't. I'm struggling with this, and I'm like some sort of loser philosophy nerd. Okay, so we're trying to explain here how is it that God has these different aspects or facets or whatever you want to call them, like omniscience, omnipresence, ultimate freedom, goodness. If you're a Christian, he's going to be triune and other things like that, right? Now, those things seem to be different. We seem to be postulating different facets, aspects, properties, whatever, of God. So that doesn't seem to be fundamentally simple. It seems like there's a bunch of different stuff that we sort of put in there. Now, that's going to be a problem because that's going to reduce the plausibility of that explanation, right? That the explanatory virtue of that. So they're trying to get around that by saying, well, no. God is a trope, this sort of module trope, and that is ultimately simple. So how is it simple? Well, it's simple because all of these things that I've talked about, omniscience, omnipresence, freedom, goodness, triuneness, and all of that stuff, they're all numerically identical, but self-differentiating aspects of the underlying omnipotence module trope. So they're identical to each other, and therefore they're not like distinct things that you need to postulate, but they are self-differentiating aspects. I don't pretend to know what that means. Again, I want to emphasize that not understanding something doesn't constitute an argument against it, but it certainly doesn't. If I can't understand what's being said, then I mean, I'm not going to be persuaded by it either. So I'm trying to make a genuine effort here, but I'm dubious as to the coherence of what's being said here. Yes, and of course, I suppose I have to go and read all these papers now, which I may get to at some point. But at the moment, I'm focusing on this video and trying to make sense of what they're saying here. I mean, they've had 2 hours. They have 2 hours, right? So that's sort of, I expect that you can explain something in that.
Trope features, right? And so often trope theorists are bundle theorists, meaning that and those tropes taken together unify in such a way that it bestows the two, which is a really interesting concept, to be able to have duplicates of tropes. And if you want to see a trope theoretic approach, an aspectivalist approach, and it is what actually convinced me that is of God here, not taken in the analogous sense, not taken in numerically distinct sense,
here's where he says
numerically identical to one another, is because we're able to bypass Leibniz's law of indiscernibles. What we're able to have is we're able to think about these things in terms of what Donald Baxter calls aspects. That these are intrinsic, self-different, qualitatively self-differing aspects of
intrinsic, qualitatively self-differing aspects, which are nevertheless numerically identical with each other.
Of an object, right? So we say that you have omnipotence, but an aspect of omnipotence would be perfect goodness. And what that would mean is that it's omnipotence insofar as the power to do a best action where there is one, or many good actions where there are one, right? Or it is the power to, so it's omnipotence insofar.
So an aspect of omnipotence is perfect goodness, which means it is, I guess, metaphysically impossible for something to be omnipotent but not have perfect goodness. I don't even, maybe it's even I don't think it's a semantic claim. I think it's got to be a metaphysical claim. Not sure why you would think that, but this is what we're being told, right?
As far as the power to know all true propositions and believing no false propositions, right? And you can do that for all of the traditional attributes and characteristics of God that's been described. But these things don't have to be ontologically, numerically distinct properties. Rather, these are aspects of one single numerically identical property, which is God is his omnipotence. God doesn't have omnipotence. God is omnipotence. If God is omnipotence, then God is just goodness, because an aspect of omnipotence is goodness. It's a
yeah, I don't know why goodness is an aspect of omnipotence. I don't know why. What were some of these other ones? I don't know why. We're not told why. I'm trying to find this diagram. Yeah, we're not told why freedom is an aspect of omnipotence, like absolute freedom. I suppose you might say, well, if you have omnipotence, you have to be free. I mean, I don't know that that's true, right? I suppose it's going to depend on how you define omnipotence. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that you have to build in a libertarian understanding of that. Goodness is particularly odd to me. I don't know why you would have to be good just because you're omnipotent. I'm not even sure how omniscience follows from that, because you could have power to actualize a state of affairs without having the knowledge of what will be actualized when you do that. I mean, there are plenty of theists who think that, right? There are plenty of theists who think that God is omnipotent but doesn't know the future. So I don't see the necessary connection between those. And then there's other things like being omnipresent, or being outside of time, if they think that. I don't know what they think about the relationship of God and time, or being triune, whatever other aspects we want to predicate of God, you're going to have to argue that these are sort of like identical to or aspects of omnipotence. I just think that's a bit of a tall order, especially if we're going with some sort of epistemic notion of probability here, which I guess, given what they said at the outset, they're sort of not. They're saying that probability is this objective relationship between propositions, but then it doesn't seem very useful, right? Like, how do we know what that is? But the point is, if we're going to say, well, as far as we can tell, there's no necessary connection between these different like aspects of God, well, then what's the reason for thinking that they must be the same? Like, it seems probabilistically we're going to think based on like, as arguments as far as we can tell, that there's no reason to think that they do go together necessarily, and so therefore they do constitute separate postulates when it comes to outlining theism as an explanation. So I don't know, this just seems very ad hoc to me. I'm not convinced that they haven't really done much to convince me that I should see all of these different things as aspects of one underlying omnipotence trope.
I said at the very beginning of this stream that this is going to be a very challenging episode, and if we just stop and have to explain over and over and over like I'm kind of doing now, then it's just going to mess with the flow of everything. So we're just going to continue moving on, and we'll get through the whole thing. If you have questions or comments, then leave them in.
So it's too complicated to try to explain, so we're just going to not try to explain it. Okay, whatever. I think that's pathetic, but
in the comments below, and maybe Kyle.
Narrative approach probability. Now, this is actually incredibly relevant.
Hang on, did we talk about?
And this also doesn't have to be the last time that we have them on. We can also do other shows with them and stuff.
Yeah,
so, anyways,
I think we covered that.
How we would, if it were
but now we're talking about probability again. Let me just have a quick look at chat here. How can you differentiate these tropes from any other ideas that humans can subjectively construct? Well, you differentiate them by what they're supposed to do theoretically, right? So tropes are supposed to have various theoretic virtues. I sort of skipped over that part. No, I didn't skip over that. That was a different thing that I skipped over. I don't think that they've really talked about this. He sort of mentioned briefly some of the alleged advantages of tropes. I mean, one of the issues is sort of trying to account for how it is that distinct like objects can have the same property. So suppose I say that I have a red apple here and a red car over here, right? So you want to say they're both red. Let's say hypothetically like the exact shade of red, just for simplicity. And a question might be like, well, in virtue of what are they both like red? Like, what is it that makes them have that property? Or what do they share in both being that particular shade of red? Different people give different answers to this, but at least on the surface of it, some people think that there's something a bit odd going on here because they're two different things, right? And yet they're supposed to both in some way instantiate or possess this property, which can exist at like multiple locations at once. It's like this sort of redness thing is here and over here at the same time. So while an object can only exist at a particular place, like a token of a particular object or a particular entity can only be instantiated at like one point in space and time at once. It seems that properties aren't like that. They can exist at multiple points in space and time at once. And so then the question is, well, what sort of things are properties? Like, how can we account for them? Now, I personally think that the best account of properties is to regard them as a species of causal powers, or like reducible to causal powers of objects. But that's just my own personal view. I think that, yeah, so I mean, sorry, I got a bit distracted there. So those are some of the questions one might ask. Some people then introduce the idea of a trope in order to try to address some of these questions, like, well, how is it that an object can be at a particular place in time and space, and then also have this sort of relationship to something that exists seemingly outside of time and space? And so they introduce this notion of a trope, which is like a property instance. And I don't fully understand exactly how that's supposed to resolve all these issues, but that's at least the claim, that it helps us to resolve some of these sort of theoretical problems. And then if you can give an account as to how this notion of a trope helps us to solve these problems, then the argument is that validates the use of the concept, just like a scientific concept that helps us to account for different phenomena is validated by its explanatory value, right? So that's sort of the idea.
Theory, like we were to entertain.
Anyway, let's move on.
So we're treating theism as a hypothesis in a way that's relevantly similar to a scientific hypothesis. Now, I'm gonna couch on that for a second, because I don't want people to accuse me of claims that, let's say, more radical creationists would make. That we're trying to say that theism is exactly that of science, and so therefore we should teach.
Yeah, I think we're going to skip this part. They're saying that a theory is a narrative which attempts to tell a coherent and compelling story about data so as to portray its probable truth, or in a way that portrays its probable truth. Now, I'm not. It seems to me that this conflicts with what they said earlier, that on their view of explanationism, the intrinsic probability is a function of how simple the highest level hypotheses are, and that these hang on, what slide did I want here? Yeah, probabilities are mind-independent support relations between propositions. So if probabilities are mind-independent support relations, I'm not quite sure how a narrative relates to that, because narratives are not mind-independent. Narrative is a story that you tell. Unless you want to define a narrative as like a series of events, then maybe that can be mind-independent. I'm just not sure. I don't know how that relates to what they said earlier. It's not clear to me, but I don't have a huge objection to this. I personally wouldn't describe a theory as a narrative. I suppose I don't know. Depends how you define narrative. But I think the point here is that a theory is just going to tell us why we should expect certain data, like outline the sort of evidential relations, support relations, or whatever between given data, so that we understand why is it that this happened instead of something else. I'm broadly all right with that, so let's sort of move on. They talk about the difference between retrodiction and prediction. I am just going to skip that here because I don't think it's critical. I understand that a lot of this is going to be, so retrodiction referring to like giving an account of things that we already know, like explaining why there is a universe. You're not going to predict the existence of a universe because everyone knows there is a universe. So things like that, certain things can only be retrodicted. Any historical explanation is by nature retrodictive, unless you predict like a new archaeological find or something. But in general, it's retrodictive because we know what the evidence is. We're just trying to give an account as to why it is the way that it is. We can't necessarily make predictions for lots of explanations, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem. There is debate about that, but let's move on from that here. Now this is important. It's a bit hard to follow the structure of this presentation, so I'm doing the best. So far they've talked a bit about different epistemic aspects. I think that broadly I'm on the same ground epistemically as them, at least close enough. Basically, what they want to talk about is giving competing explanations for a set of phenomena, and you adjudicate the explanation on the basis of explanatory merits. I think that we have some different ideas about prior probability, which we might get back to. But broadly, I'm okay with that. And what they wanted to say here is that theism has the capacity for providing better explanations than competing worldviews. And in order to ground that claim, or to justify that claim, they introduced the idea of the module trope for God, right? So God is this omnipotence trope, which has different aspects. And because it only has one underlying, like there's one trope, the aspects of which are numerically identical with each other, then it's ultimately simple, so they don't need to postulate very much. The question would be, how much can you explain with that postulate? Well, that's what we're getting to here.
Explanations when we come to the scene of the data. And that's it for that one.
Yeah. So what Tim was saying, so now that we have epistemic probability covered, now that we have retrodiction covered, now that we understand that God is consistent with background knowledge, now we have to get into, okay, well, what is that? That doesn't really tell us anything about what theism is actually going to predict or retrodict, or how does theism explain things? Well, there's actually three principles that we want to propose here. So the first one is what's called the diffusiveness principle. So this principle basically just says that goodness is necessarily diffusive of itself. So this is a principle that Siddhartha himself uses in two of his papers. And so the basic idea behind the diffusiveness principle is that God has to do something. So just by the very fact that God is all good, he kind of has to, by his nature, do some kind of action, right? And it's just going to be an inevitable consequence of God's nature that he does an action, right? It's just by the nature of goodness itself that God is going to do something. Now, it's questionable what God will bring about, so that's still a further question. But the basic idea behind the diffusiveness principle is that because goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself, then goodness, in this case God, would inevitably bring about other good things, right? So that's all that the diffusiveness principle is stating. So now we get into the second principle, which is...
All right. So this diffusiveness principle is absolutely crucial to most of their subsequent arguments, because what they're going to try to do is say that God's omnibenevolence is, well, essentially it's identical. It's an aspect of the omnipotence trope. So they sort of get that for free. I've questioned that, but put that to the side. Then from the omnipotence trope, they're going to say, based on certain axiological principles, axiological meaning like theories of value. So based on certain principles about what's value and what's not, plus some other principles that they invoke, like these ones here, they're going to say, well, this is what we would expect God to do, given that he's omnibenevolent. And surprise, surprise, it turns out that what you expect God to do is create a universe more or less like ours, right? And so, but this is sort of the link as I understand it. So they go from the omnibenevolence module trope to the goodness like omnibenevolence aspect. And then from that, plus these additional principles here, you get predictions about what types of creative acts God would be likely to perform. And that allows you then to account for a wide range of features of reality. This is sort of similar broadly to Swinburne's approach, although he doesn't use trope ontology as far as I'm aware and things like that. So it's kind of more technical. But anyway, one of the key principles that they need to postulate here is this diffusiveness principle. I don't know if it's diffusiveness or diffusiveness. I guess diffusiveness is like a physics term, but I don't know if it's spelled the same. Anyway, I'm just going to call it diffusiveness principle because I like the sound of that better. So this principle here is that goodness necessarily is expansive or creative, right? Goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. A good being will inevitably bring about other good beings. Now, I looked up this paper and to see if there was more of an explanation about this principle or what it means or why we should believe it, and there wasn't. So first of all, there's two questions here. Does this principle make sense, and why should we believe it? Does it make sense? I don't really think it makes any sense. I would describe as goodness as a property, right? So different states of affairs are more or less good, right? We could argue, well, what makes a state of affairs good or bad? There's different theories about that. But if you like, you can say that a state of affairs is good if it is conducive or entails isn't the right word. Incorporates, conducive to or incorporates or entails some kind of positive well-being for a sentient creature, and it's bad if it entails or leads to or incorporates negative well-being for some sort of creature. Could be human or animal or otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that you have to buy that, right? That's just to make it concrete if that helps. I mean, there could be other things that you think make a state of affairs good or bad, epistemic or aesthetic value or something else, right? But anyway, so we have some state of affairs, some situation in the world, bunch of situations in the world, and we can say, well, they're good or they're bad, like how good or bad they are, depending on what properties they have. This idea that goodness, therefore, somehow requires something just makes no sense to me. Like, I don't know that just seems wrong. It seems there's some sort of category mistake going on here. Goodness is, I would say, a property of states of affairs. I don't think properties, like, by themselves cause anything or, like, require anything. It just sort of is, right? So we might say that we have some kind of obligation to bring about good states of affairs. I mean, you may or may not believe that. I don't know that that's the sense of what requires means here. I don't think they mean requires as in requires of a moral agent, because it says here a good being will inevitably bring about other good beings, not that a good being has an obligation to bring about other good beings. So I would say that a good person has a moral obligation to do good things, to bring about good states of affairs. Fine with that. But they won't necessarily, right? They should, but that doesn't mean that they will. Certainly it doesn't mean that they will necessarily. And also, so I don't know that there's any inevitability of the matter, but also good being. So a being could be, there seems to be an equivocation here, right? Because you could say a state of affairs is good to the extent that it like exemplifies whatever good-making properties you think there are, like well-being or something, fairness or aesthetic value, whatever. Any things that you think make something good, a state of affairs is good to the extent that it exemplifies those. Now, then you could say a moral agent is good. Generally, though, that's a different type of attribution. If I say that this is a good person, what I mean is that they have a character such that they often do good things, or that they have a disposition to bring about good actions or to help other people, something like that, right? So one is essentially praising the character or actions of a moral agent. The other is attributing some kind of property of a state of affairs, and they're pretty different things, and they're kind of separate from each other, right? Like I might say that this is well, yeah, maybe I won't give that example because that could be a bit more, that could confuse more than it will clarify. But the point is here that I don't know when they say good being, do they mean that like good agents, like morally praiseworthy agents, will inevitably bring about good states of affairs? That could be what they're saying. But if that's the claim, then all they're really saying is that God will do good things because he is because he is omnibenevolent. But the problem is that there's no content there about what it means for him to do good things. So for God to do good things, it could well just be enjoy his, I don't know, enjoy his own essence, however God does that. Like, I don't know, bask in the glory of the Trinity or whatever. There's nothing, that doesn't really seem to get to the diffusiveness aspect, which is bring about other good things. That's the key thing. God has to bring something about other than himself. So you could say, well, of course, if God is omnibenevolent, he's going to do good things. But what is it? What is that good thing going to be? And the diffusiveness principle wants to say that it's not, God's not going to just, bask in his own awesomeness or whatever. He is going to bring about something in addition, beyond, outside of, external to himself, like other good things. And I don't know where that comes from. Like, why? It seems like you need an axiology to say, well, embodied moral agents existing outside of God is intrinsically good in and of itself, and therefore God has a reason to bring those about. That's something like what Swinburne says. But that's not what's being said here. All that's being said is that goodness requires something as a manifestation of it, something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. So I don't know if this is being said only of moral agents that are all good, or is this a general principle like any state of affairs that is good will inevitably somehow like propagate goodness? That seems just crazy to me. Just because a state of affairs is good doesn't mean that it's going to cause other good states of affairs. It may be good now, but then something bad could happen, right? Like there's no necessary, you might be having a great picnic and then a tree branch falls on you and ruins the picnic. Like the state of affairs was good, but then something happened and it turned bad. I don't know what the necessity is there, but if it's not talking about states of affairs and it's instead talking about moral agents, then that doesn't really seem to answer any question, because of course an omnibenevolent God is only going to do good things, but the question is, what is it? What is it that God will do that is good? Like, what are the good making properties in virtue of which God will do one thing over another thing? Like, we're not really told. To say that God will necessarily bring about something outside of himself is a substantive claim that needs some defense, and I just don't really see what that defense is. So I find it difficult to make sense of what this claim is saying. My best pass of it is that it simply seems to be saying that God will make something outside of himself that is good, but it doesn't say what that would be. Like, well, but what things are good such that God would make them? We're really not told. For all we know, those things could be just like, I don't know, abstract objects or rocks, or like we don't have any axiology to put some substance to this. So it doesn't seem like a very useful claim. And I'm just not really sure. Okay, so the key issue here, I think, is why is it that the good things that God will do involve bringing about something outside of himself? Because if God is perfectly good, why does there need to be anything beyond that? Why is it not the case that God's actions consist in him simply enjoying and participating in his own perfect goodness? It's not like he lacks something and needs to go outside himself to fill a gap, because there isn't any, right? He's perfect and, sufficient by himself. So that seems to be an issue here from my point of view. And then there's a further question as to, okay, if he is going to create something, then what is it? Like, what are the good-making features? Because we don't really have any substantive notion of what good is here. We're told that God is omnibenevolent, and that is in some way identical to omnipotence, the omnipotence trope module, right? So then how does that help us to tell anything about what God would create? I don't know. I think that this is all a bit of a bundle of nonsense here, to be honest. So Chris, we talked about this before. So the claim is that God's goodness follows as an aspect of his omnipotence, not his omnipotence trope, of the omnipotence trope, which is identical to God, and omnibenevolence is an aspect of that, which is numerically identical to, but what was it, intrinsically self-differentiating or something? I forget the term he used, which makes it a separate aspect, but it's numerically identical. Now, I can't really make sense of that myself, but that's the claim. So the issue here is I don't know that claim has any substance outside of some kind of some theory of good and bad or right and wrong, which we're not given. And And I don't think everyday morality is going to really help us here, because everyday morality is situated in a society with other people, where God making his creation decision isn't. So I don't think ordinary morality is going to help us at all here to determine what God would be likely to do. So there's the issue here of why believe the diffusiveness principle. There's the issue here of what does the diffusiveness principle say that God would create? Like, what sort of things would he do? Would he bring about external to himself? So I think that those are major issues here. Okay, let's then look at the next one. The plenitude
is the plenitude principle. So Sushwati says, quote, God...
Plenitude or plentitude? I'm getting confused. Whatever. Plenitude.
brings things into existence in order to communicate his goodness to creatures and to represent his goodness through them. And since his goodness cannot be adequately represented by any one creature, he produced many diverse creatures, so that what was lacking in one's representation of the divine goodness may be supplied by another. For the goodness that exists in a simple and unified way in God exists in multiple and divided ways among creatures. Hence, the universe as a whole participates and represents God's goodness in a more perfect way than any one creature does. So I guess we could say is the idea behind the plenitude principle is that in any world that God creates, there's going to have to be a plenitude of things or a diversity of good things. So there can't just be a world where, let's say, it's just me, Cameron, and Tim. Like, that's not enough. That God actually, by his nature, is going to have to create a multiplicity of good things other than, let's say, moral agents or something like that. And we'll get into that later in the presentation, what those might look like. But I guess the idea behind the diffusiveness principle is that God has to do something. He has to create a world. Again, it's not saying anything about what God has to create, right? Just rather that God has to bring about good things. And then the plenitude principle would further restrict that by saying that whatever God brings about, there has to be a multiplicity or a diversity of good things. Again, we're going to get more into what that might be later, but that's sort of the core idea behind these two principles. And I would say that these principles are actually just entailed from the goodness of God. So next slide. So the final principle is what I call the ultimate goodness principle.
Yeah. Okay. So, apparently these two principles are entailed by the goodness of God. So they're not separate principles or postulates. They're entailed from God's goodness, which, remember, is really just numerically identical to his omnipotence trope, which is itself identical to God. We're not told why these things just follow from God's goodness, which I think is a major issue because it's highly not obvious to me. Let me put it that way. But let's also look at the plenitude principle. So what we're told is that God brings things into existence to communicate his goodness to creatures. Now, this seems to be completely putting the cart before the horse here because, I mean, there are no creatures apart from God, right? I don't normally call him a creature. So why are there creatures at all such that God needs to communicate anything to them? First, we need to be told why God creates creatures, and then we'll worry about what he wants to communicate to them. So, like, he says God brought things into existence in order to communicate his goodness to creatures. But it's not like there were just creatures there and then God thought he needed to communicate to them. God created the creatures. So is it intrinsically good that God creates creatures and communicates himself to them? Why? What does that have to do with anything? That's not obvious to me that it's just intrinsically good for God to communicate his existence to creatures. Why is that better than God just, chilling by himself or by his own threesomeness or, whatever? I don't see the principle here. Why is that something that's a good making property for God to communicate himself to creatures? But anyway, since his goodness cannot be adequately represented by any one creature, he produced diverse creatures so that what's lacking in one might be supplied by the other. Well, why can't God's goodness be represented by any one creature? Isn't God omnipotent? Can't he just create a creature that adequately represents his goodness? Whatever that means. I mean, what does it mean to represent God's goodness? I don't know. We're not told. And so I don't really know how to make sense of that. Like, what notion of representation are we talking about here? Surely only God can perfectly represent his goodness because, nothing else is God, right? So why are we even worried about this? But I mean, God is omnipotent. So are we saying that it's logically impossible for God to create something that represents him? Instead, he has to create a multitude of things. That seems to be saying that God has this limitation that he can't represent himself properly. I mean, why? Well, I guess we're told that the goodness that exists in a simple and uniform way in God exists in a multiple and divided way among creatures. Why? What does it mean to say goodness exists in a simple and uniform way? This comes back to what I was saying before. So what are we talking about when we say God's goodness? Do we mean his disposition or his disposition or his character such that he does good things? what does it mean to say that his disposition is simple and uniform? I don't know what's being communicated there. Dispositions don't seem to be the sort of thing that are simple and uniform. And anyway, how is it that God's disposition can exist in other creatures, especially creatures that aren't anything like God? Like, we're not anything like God. We're not, omnipotent and omniscient. We don't exist outside of space and time. We're highly limited and in our knowledge and in our powers, and we decay and all this other stuff. In what way does God's good character, assuming that's what's being referred to here, in what way does that exist in us? The universe as a whole participates in and represents God's goodness. But it's like God's goodness isn't enough by itself. It somehow needs a universe of divided stuff to represent it. Why does it need anything out there? I mean, doesn't God do the job of representing himself properly? It's like he needs an imperfect, divided version to kind of... Why is any of this needed? I guess that somehow comes from the diffusiveness principle, but we're not really told why. So I guess we're being told here that God's not enough by himself. He kind of needs to, or has this compulsion to make something outside of himself. We're not told why. But then in addition to that, God just won't make like one thing. He won't make like a copy of himself or some, abstracted version. He's going to make a whole bunch of little things which are highly imperfect, but together, combine to be better than individually or something. We're not really told why he does it that way either. Why doesn't he just make something that reflects his goodness, whatever reflects goodness means? Why doesn't he just make one thing that does that, or two things? No, it has to be a multitude of things. These things are just being, from my point of view, these things are just being asserted without any argument. It's highly unclear what's being said here because the language is so vague and imprecise, and subject to multiple interpretations. Like, I'm having to do a lot of work here trying to work out what's being said. But the other thing is that it's just not motivated. Why does God need to or want to make anything outside of himself? And why is it that he wouldn't just make a few things or even one thing outside of himself? Why would he make a whole bunch of like individually not very good or like not highly reflective of him things? Seems like the opposite way he would do it to me, but whatever.
Goodness of God. Next slide. This is what it says. So for any S, state of affairs, S can be instantiated by God if at some time T, S bears the axiological status of being good on the whole. Now, I want to sort of stop there and think, what do we mean by good on the whole? Well, think of it like this. So it's actually pretty relevant, I would say, for the problem of evil, because what people will often say is that, well, God can't create like an imperfect world. Like, God had to start off with a perfect world, right? But actually, this principle says, no, that all that God has to create is that that at some time, so any world that God creates at some time, must that world bear the axiological status of being good on the whole. And so one way you can think about this is if God creates a world that is, let's say, initially imperfect, or let's say that this world needs to develop, right? As long as that world reaches the status of being good on the whole, then it's not really an issue for God's goodness, right? Because what God is looking at, he's looking at the full timeline of a world rather than any specific point in that world. And this is, I think, relevant for, I don't want to get too much in the arguments from evil here, but one sort of consequence of this, the UGBT principle, is that for any world that God creates, that if there is evil in that world, then that evil must be defeated, basically. That.
Again, I think that this principle is underspecified. So any state of affairs can be produced by God if at some time the state of affairs is good on the whole. So at some time could mean there is like a fixed specified time when any state of affairs must be good on the whole. But I'm guessing that that's not what is meant here. I'm guessing that there just has to exist a time t such that like any state, like each state of affairs can have a different time t, such that as long as there is some time when that state of affairs is good on the whole, then God can instantiate that state of affairs. But that doesn't seem consistent with how I think about a state of affairs being good on the whole. I want to think about its whole temporal history. So let's suppose I go through a horrible experience. Let's say I go out on an outing and it's a terrible day, everything goes wrong. But at the very end of the day, I buy myself a milkshake, and like that little bit is nice. But I wouldn't have bought the milkshake if everything hadn't happened before it, right? So do we want to say that because the milkshake is nice, like that experience mentioned in isolation is nice, that therefore, and let's say that experience in isolation is sort of good on the whole, but the whole day was lousy. Like if I was to say, would you do it again? I'd say no. But like the milkshake part was good, just taken by itself. What I want to say is the day as a whole, the day taken as a whole was not good, right? And it wasn't good just because some time slice of the day was good on the whole. Like the day as a whole wasn't good on the whole because one bit of it was. What I want to take a temporally holistic approach to that. I mean, that seems the reasonable way to understand on the whole, right? Is to look over the whole time course and see, added up over that time, would we say that that was a good thing or a bad thing? Like, is it better or worse to have done that relative to some baseline? So I don't know. The point is, I don't know what the time is here. Time is kind of irrelevant, right? We're not thinking about any particular time. We're looking back, as it were, across the whole time course of whatever the state of affairs is that we're considering, and asking, on the whole, over the whole time, and given all of the factors, was it good or bad? So that's why I say I don't think that the time aspect is helpful here. You don't want to say that just because it's good at this little instant that therefore the whole thing was good, because the rest of it could have outweighed that. So you want to consider across the whole time, but then the at some time thing isn't doing any work here. Now, let's suppose that we just ignore that and say that God can create a state of affairs if it's good on the whole. This seems completely wrong to me, right? An omnibenevolent being would not, in my view, create a state of affairs just because it's good on the whole. So let me give an analogy to that. Suppose, let's see, what is a good example of this? Okay, suppose I'm giving someone a gift, right? Yeah, like it's a sort of a gift exchange thing. So they get a present for me, I get a present for them. It's a bit of a reciprocal sort of arrangement, and it's an expression of, how much I care about them and so forth. Let's suppose that the expectation is, like, given what's happened in the past, I'll get them something that's a thoughtful, personalized gift that shows a certain amount of time and effort and so forth, and is something that they would, like, genuinely appreciate. So that's, like, contextually what is sort of expected, and that's what they give me. And let's suppose that instead of doing that, I give them, I don't know, what can I give them? A $5 voucher at McDonald's, right? Let's suppose that's my present to them. So they're expecting this, thoughtful, personalized, and really, caring kind of gift, and they get a $5 voucher for McDonald's, which is kind of, a pretty lousy gift, I would say. Now, one could say, well, look, it's better than nothing, right? So it is permissible for me to give them the gift, because it's still better than not giving any gift, right? And now I would be inclined to say, well, a good friend is not going to give a gift like that just because it's better than nothing. What they're going to do is they're going to give an appropriate gift, commensurate to the type of relationship you have with the person and so forth. Now, maybe you don't like that example because it involves gift giving, which is a bit of a complicated thing, but hopefully you sort of see the point, right? Just because something is sort of better than sort of nothing, or better than worse on the whole, doesn't mean that it is something that you would regard as acceptable, or that is expected, especially by an omnibenevolent agent, right? You expect them to go above and beyond. So I don't really understand this sort of bottom of the barrel idea about what it is acceptable or expected for an omnibenevolent agent to do. It's sort of like, well, as long as it's good enough, like, company can do that. The world might be kind of dodgy, but, like, it's slightly better than it is bad, right? All of those horrible things are outweighed a little bit by all this good stuff. So, that's fine. God can do that. My view is, well, not if he's omnibenevolent. Like, that's not what an omnibenevolent being does. An omnibenevolent does the utmost, the most good imaginable or possible or something. Now, some people come back and say, but there is no best possible state of affairs. So if that's your requirement, then that's impossible, because for any state of affairs that God could actualize, he could always actualize a slightly better one. My response to that is that's your problem, mate. That's a problem with the notion of omnibenevolence. That's not my problem. Just because you can't explain what it is to be omnibenevolent in a coherent way doesn't mean that you get to cash out in terms of this pathetic idea of, well, as long as it's more good than bad. That's clearly not omnibenevolent, right? That's just like, that's omni-mediocre. That's like, it's, P's get degrees, like just the bare minimum. I don't believe that an omnibenevolent God is a God that does the bare minimum of making slightly more good than bad. I believe omnibenevolent means, like, taking it to the max, right? Above and beyond. Truly praiseworthy. Now, if we can't actually coherently cash out what that is because of this problem of no best possible state of affairs, I mean, that's the theist problem. That ain't my problem. That's their problem. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to go from accept this idea that omnibenevolence actually means like omni-mediocrity. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And there are further problems with that as well, by the way, because this idea that you can just sort of aggregate over all of the goods and bads of a state of affairs and then come up with an all things considered overall goodness or badness is, I mean, I tend to think that you can do that, right? But that's building on a very different kind of ethical theory than I think they would accept. And many ethicists don't think that that works, right? They wouldn't say that you can torture one person in order to help 1,000 other people, even give them a lot of help, right? Because you're violating that person's rights, and that's just a categorical violation that a good person cannot do, right? And so, in cases like this, God couldn't allow suffering, allow horrific forms of suffering to be inflicted or to occur for certain people, on the justification that overall the state of affairs that allows is good, because God's then violating their rights or violating their dignity or something. So you have to buy into quite a particular theory about ethics or meta-ethics in order for this notion of good on the whole to even make sense. And then in addition to that, you have to buy into what I call this sort of omni-mediocrity idea that for an omnibenevolent God to do something, it only just has to be slightly more good than bad, which I think is ridiculous. So I don't think this principle is plausible at all. As I said, I think it has at least those two problems, the aggregation problem and then the problem of the sort of omni-mediocrity. And even aside from that, it's just not really motivated. Like, well, why accept this principle? We're just sort of told. We're not given a reason to accept it.
The evil that a creature experiences, that creature must come to embrace that suffering at some time, that they can recognize the suffering that they went through. And so you could say that a defeat of evil is itself is when a creature reaches a status of reaching being good on the whole, right? So they recognize the evil that they went through, and then they fully embrace that suffering in a way where they can recognize how the suffering that they went through actually contributed to their identity, contributed to them being good on the whole. So I just want to throw that out there because some people might say, Kyle, don't you have to conditionalize on evil for this principle? Well, no. So the ultimate goodness principle.
Slide 17, so I'll take this one. Yeah, so this is more modeling and continuing on with modeling the theistic evidence. This is called the axiom.
Do I want to discuss this? Yeah, okay, so I think I'll just explain it my way because I think it's clearer. So this is what I was saying before. What they want to say is that theism predicts something if there's some connection between that state of affairs, like the O thing, so I don't know, fine-tuning or whatever, so some state of some evidence or whatever that we're trying to explain, some postulate, sorry, not postulate, yeah, some facts that we're trying to account for. So theism explains or predicts those facts if there's some axiological relation connecting basically God's nature, like the stuff we've already said about God and his different aspects. If there's some nature of like, if there's some relation of goodness or good-making properties that connects God to that state of affairs. So basically, this is what I was saying before. They want to say that the postulate is omnibenevolence trope. An aspect of that, which is numerical identical to it, but in some way distinct, is omnibenevolence. And then from that, and I guess these axiological principles that we're appealing to, comes all of the predictions that we're going to make, all of the explanations that we're going to draw on about theism. So essentially, they're appealing to, well, implicitly, they're appealing to omnipotence plus omnibenevolence to say, well, God would do this and that. He can do it, and this is why he would do it, because of his omnibenevolence, right? So I think that that's the essential claim that's being made here. So that's how I understand this. So let's just skip over that. This is just a standard Bayesian approach, although they have they have this explanationist understanding of Bayesianism, which is where probability relations are like objective, supportive relations, not subjective. I don't exactly know how that fits into this, but I don't really disagree with a general sort of Bayesian approach where you consider priors and posterior and so forth. So I'm just going to skip over that. Okay, so whoops, hang on. Okay, yeah, so now they're going to start talking about the evidence for theism specifically. So they're going to try to fit particular things within their framework. So let's just pause here and allow me to summarize where my disagreements are so far. So first of all, as I've said, I don't really think that this notion of theism as like trope theory has been sufficiently explained or motivated. My major concern is about the idea that these different aspects of God are somehow numerically identical as a way of rescuing divine simplicity. We're told that trope theory allows us to bypass Leibnizia's law about the indiscernibility of identicals. That is, if two things are identical, they have to be indiscernible from each other. I personally don't know how that works. As I keep saying, that doesn't constitute an argument against it, but I don't know that we've been given an argument for it or an explanation or much of anything. So that's really all I can say at this point. As that's a big question mark for me, and so is not persuasive. Then the next issue is that there were those three principles. Remember, there was the diffusiveness principle, so goodness like creates beyond itself or something. There was the plenitude principle, which is that goodness, well, specifically God doesn't create one or two things, he creates lots of things that all imperfectly reflect his good nature. And then the third one was I'm going to call, I forget what it was called, but I'm going to call it the omni-mediocrity principle, which is the idea that God would create something or is, God would create something or is allowed to create something or is inclined to create something if that state of affairs overall is slightly more good than it is bad. Now, all of those principles from my point of view are distinct principles that are not derivable in any way that has been explained. They are not derivable from omnibenevolence, and so they need to be postulated. We're not given any reasons for accepting any of them, and I think all of them on the face of it are extremely implausible. I don't know why a perfectly good God would or need to or feel desires to or whatever create anything whatever beyond his own self. So I reject the diffusiveness principle. I reject the plenitude principle. Even if God was going to create something beyond himself, I don't know why that would be a bunch of things that imperfectly reflect him. Like, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. If anything, why would not he create copies or variations of himself instead of some other crappy version? And then the omni-mediocrity principle, as I've said, I don't really buy that you can just necessarily talk about aggregating goodness and badness in this way. At least there's questions there. But more fundamentally, I think that an omnibenevolent God doesn't just do the bare minimum in terms of slightly more good than bad, but an omnibenevolent being is actually going to do the utmost, something that's truly praiseworthy and great, not just like slightly better than worse. And so I reject this omni-mediocrity conception of God. So already at the outset, I have serious issues with the key principles that they've structured. And it's not really the epistemic principles. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think broadly I'm okay with those. It's the sort of metaphysical principles that they're postulating as the basis of their explanation. I think that they're all highly suspect and implausible. However, so what we're going to see now then is what they want to do with those principles. Let's just accept those principles for the sake of argument. What can we explain on the basis of those principles? That's where we're going to now.
So now we're going to get into, did you want to do this part, Tim, or did you want me to go over the evidence? Or
I have no, this is my part.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So so we're now going to get to the part that probably everybody else is wanting to get into, which is the evidence for theism. But we still have to go over how we're actually going to model this evidence. And so this part right here, if you're going to listen very carefully, it's going to be this part right here. And so what we're saying in this slide is that all theistic evidence can actually, because we're coming from a standpoint and a framework of axiology, we're always going back to goodness, we're always going back to value. Things are always explained in terms of value. That's how we make our predictions. Then I think that we can actually propose a 3-category taxonomy for taxonomizing theistic evidence. How we're able to do that is, it's commonly said by those who believe in a benevolent foundational reality that there is the true, the good, and the beautiful. This saying goes back to ancient philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers, that either you view God as the absolute, the all abundance, or traditional monotheistic versions of theism. It's this idea that God is the purest concentration of all qualities. And these qualities, if we're able to pull them out in kind of a branching structure, we're able to actually identify them as you have beauty, you have goodness, and then you have truth. And that's all summed and summed up by who God is. So if our explanation is in terms of value, then we should be able to look at the states of affairs of the world, and we should be able to group them into this 3-category taxonomy. So you have 3 domains: the moral domain, the alethic domain, and the aesthetic domain. And so if you look at the diagram on the right, you start from a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. Through a relation of axiology, branches out into these 3 different domains: morals, truth, and beauty, right? And so this can actually be derived independently from the plenitude principle. But it must be a variety of goods that each represent an aspect of God's goodness, right? An aspect of God's goodness is that he is truth. The aspect of God's goodness is that he is good. The aspect of God's goodness is that he is beautiful, right? And this is something that all really Christian monotheists, Western and Eastern, have all agreed upon, whether or not you take more of a mystical approach or not.
All right, I have a number of issues here. One, the fact that people have said this for a long time is not an argument for something. William Lane Craig sometimes says this as well, like, well, theists have always said so and so, as if that's somehow an argument for thinking that it's reasonable to say, or that it's not still ad hoc, just because people can say an ad hoc thing for a long time or an unreasonable thing for a long time. It can still be ad hoc or unreasonable. So that's kind of irrelevant to me. But now the idea that this sort of tripartite distinction between morality, truth, and beauty is predicted by the plenitude principle seems absurd to me. The plenitude principle was supposed to be the idea that God creates different things which each imperfectly or partially reflect his goodness. Again, I don't really know what it means for something to reflect God's goodness, or why God needs anything to reflect his goodness, but putting that aside, this trichotomy just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, truth, if you think that there are morals, then they are truths, right? So morals are just a subset of any truth. Likewise, beauty. If there are objective aesthetic claims, those are also truths. So this isn't even a trichotomy. Often it's described in terms of like good, the true, and the beautiful. And those are different ways of thinking about aspects of reality, I suppose. But I wouldn't say that they're like a trichotomy, that we can categorize things as good, true, or beautiful. I mean, anything that we predicate like correctly or accurately of something is going to be true, right? So that seems to be a superset of everything else. And then, I mean, we can question, I'm dubious about whether there are objective aesthetic claims, but I suppose we can put that aside. I mean, many people are dubious as to whether there are objective moral claims. I tend to think that there are, but I think that the broader problem here is that this is not a trichotomy. And the idea that this has anything to do with the plenitude principle seems laughable, because the plenitude principle says that God creates different stuff that imperfectly reflects him. These aren't different things that God's created. God doesn't create truth, right? I mean, how does that even make sense? Truth is just what is, right? Or perhaps it's what we can, what we can predicate, or a certain set of statements that are entailed by tautologies or something. I mean, different ways of describing what truth is, but a simple way is just what is. And like, God doesn't create that, surely. Likewise, God doesn't create morality, or I mean, does he? If he does, that raises some interesting questions, because God can't create for axiological reasons. If God, it just creates morality. There have to be axiological principles, at least as part of God's nature, already existing within God's nature, in order for God to create for axiological, like value-related reasons. Those can't entirely just be made by God. That doesn't really make sense. Also, many philosophers would say that at least moral and at least any truths of morality, maybe of beauty as well, are necessary truths, and so it can't be created by God. So none of these things seem the slightest bit relevant to the plenitude principle, which seems to be more about God causally actualizing things in the world, like a universal people or whatever. So this just seems laughable. This trichotomy here, which isn't a trichotomy, just seems to have no bearing on anything that's been said. There must be a variety of goods that each represent an aspect of God's goodness. But these aren't aspects of it. Truth is not distinct from morals and beauty, because anything that you say that's correct is true, right? So it's not a trichotomy. They don't represent aspects of God's goodness, because they just would be, like, they would be the same as God, right? So if you're going to say that omnibenevolence is identical to God, because it's an aspect which is numerically identical to God, then that's just the same as morality, or like moral truth, or something like that, right? And presumably the same, you'd say truth and beauty as well. They're just aspects of God. They're not things that God creates that reflect parts of God. I suppose aspects, you could say, but remember that the plenitude principle says that the things that God creates each imperfectly reflect parts of God's nature, or parts of God. But if moral truth and beauty, or like good truth and beauty, if they are aspects of God, which it seems that they would have to be, given the trope theory that we saw before, then they are numerically identical to each other and numerically identical to God. So they don't imperfectly partially reflect aspects of God. They are God. they're not created by God. They are God, and they don't imperfectly reflect anything. So this is just utter rubbish. This is nonsense as far as I can tell. This is completely inconsistent with what they said before in the trope theory, in the trope theory section. Well, you might be right. It's got to be 3 domains for totally non-Trinitarian reasons. Oh my goodness. Yeah, let's keep going.
This is what God is. And so it's unsurprising that if we look into the world, that we're able to observe morals, we're able to observe aesthetics. We're able to observe truth, right? And so whenever you look into the world and you go, does this observation support the hypothesis of theism? Well, you can ask,
how could there be a world in which you couldn't observe truth? Like, what would that even mean? A reality in which there was no distinction between things that were and things that were not. Like, I don't know. I don't know how we can even say, well, truth exists, therefore that points to God. Like, what are you even saying at that point? Again, fundamental aspects of like truth or even morality, some of that's thought to be, I mean, most people are going to say those are necessary truths. I mean, that creates issues as well. They can't depend on God if they're necessary, unless it's themselves identical to God, in which case you can't make this argument. Anyway.
Ask yourself, well, are we able to group that? Are we able to label that in some axiological domain? Does it relate to morality? Does it relate to truth? Does it relate to beauty, right? So you can put these in different categories, right? So the world domain, what do we observe?
All right, so let's sort of forget about that tripartite thing here and just think of this as a handy way of classifying things. So they're going to say that theism has predictive power over these different aspects of reality, right? So the existence of moral agents, I don't think they talk about that, moral knowledge, an orderly universe, universal beauty, I don't know what that is. And in terms of truth, like mathematical and logical truths. I mean, honestly, most philosophers are at least like moral knowledge, mathematical and logical truths, possibly an aspect of universal beauty. I don't know much about aesthetics, so the point is most philosophers who believe in such things are going to say that they're necessary, either logically necessary or at least metaphysically, probably logically necessary in the case of like logical truths. So it's not clear that they need any explanation or further grounding. This is certainly what Oppie's going to say. He's going to say that an orderly complex universe is also metaphysically necessary. They sort of mention this later, but I don't think that they really have a response. I guess we'll get to that. Well, they have a good response at least. So, I mean, even at the outset, before we ask about details or anything, and even if we accept that all of these things exist, which I don't, by the way, I don't think that mathematical truths exist. I mean, I'm a nominalist. I'm not sure about universal beauty or whatever, but even if we just accept all of these, we're just going to say that these things exist necessarily. You know, in whatever sense we understand that, and then we have to give a theory about necessary existence, right? But, you know, not many philosophers are going to say that we need to postulate a God to understand any of these things. The main exception might be the orderly complex universe, which is the fine-tuning argument. But again, I think the most popular response, other than to deny fine-tuning, is simply to say that the initial state of the universe or some of the constants or some combination of those things is just necessary. So then what's the issue? Well, we don't need to explain that. So most of these things I just think are not good candidates for God to explain, because it's not actually clear that there is any need to explain anything. It seems that these are necessary truths. It seems we actually have good reason to think that like moral knowledge, insofar as it exists, is necessary, at least certain fundamental moral truths, or like mathematical truths. God doesn't create mathematical truths, like they're necessarily true. Same with logical truths. Maybe certain universal truths of beauty, if they exist, are similar to that. So I just don't think these are very plausible, except maybe the orderly complex universe would be the one candidate, because that's a concrete entity, as opposed to many of these seem to be abstract. I guess moral agents as well we could talk about. So yeah, at the outset, I don't think this is a good set of things for the most part. I guess I should say most philosophers wouldn't say moral agents exist necessarily. So I guess that one is different. But anyway. All right, let's talk about this example here.
And higher states of consciousness. And so we're able to kind of tease out and really epistemically discover like what these things mean. Higher states of consciousness and agape love, an ongoing striving over our own primitive states. So that's moral development. That's a development beyond our simple biology, which is a striving towards virtue, because virtues have to be hard won. So now we have a virtue-based axiology, right? It allows us to gain moral knowledge.
Why do virtues have to be hard won? Does God hard win his virtues, or does he just simply possess them necessarily? Does a virtue become non-virtuous if the person didn't have to work hard to have that virtue? If they're simply naturally good-natured and kind to people, does that mean they don't have that virtue? I'm not an expert on virtue ethics, but at least it seems to me that the theist certainly doesn't want to say that a virtue has to be hard won, because then God doesn't have any virtues, because God didn't hard win anything. He just is that way. And likewise, even in terms of people, it seems that, I mean, if you just have a virtue, you never even had to develop it. You just sort of were that way. It's still a virtue, right? Perhaps you're not praiseworthy for having developed the virtue, but you're praiseworthy for having it, right? Those are different things. Having it versus for having developed it. I don't see any problem with that. Anyway, so that's just one example. I mean, he said a whole bunch of things here. most of these things, it's going to be a case of citation needed or like explanation needed. Like, why is it that virtues have to be hard won? Why is that relevant? That raises a question, well, why doesn't then God just create people who have all of the virtues? He's going to say, well, no, we can't do that because they have to be hard won. My question is, well, God doesn't seem to have need to hard won them, and at least theoretically, it seems that that's not necessary. So why do you think that they have to be hard won? We're told that like striving over primitive selves is, I guess that's morally good. I'm actually not sure why. So if you ask me what things are intrinsically morally good, it's going to be something like the well-being of sentient beings. It's not striving over primitive selves, because, you know, I could have a society of people or beings that don't strive. I mean, I guess that maybe you'd have to say well-being involves some sort of striving, but not striving over primitive selves, at least not over, you know, the sort of highly motivating and negative impulses that humans have. I would say, you know, a better society is one where people actually don't have those. You know, there may be disagreement here about whether that's true, but I at least think it's plausible, and therefore an argument needs to be given about why it's intrinsically good, or a fundamental principle that it is good to strive over primitive selves. I reckon it's better not to have those in the first place, at least for the most part. Maybe we have like some struggles, but they're like limited. We don't need to struggle over, you know, horrific impulses and addiction and other things that are just terrifying. Like, why is it better to have those things? Why not just not have those things? So this harkens back to what I was saying before, that there's an appeal to like these axiological connections here about like, well, we can understand why things exist in virtue of God's good nature, right? But unless we're given some meat on the bones about what that actually means, what is goodness, what are good making properties in virtue of what are things good, we can't really predict anything. So we need to have that axiology. And then we're sort of given a half-baked one here that just sort of appeals to these sort of random ideas, disconnected or seemingly disconnected ideas, and they're just not justified. So I can just say, well, no, I don't accept that is a fundamental principle. I don't accept that God would create embodied beings because it's intrinsically good for them to strive over their primitive selves and develop virtues, because I don't think those things are intrinsically good. I think that well-being is intrinsically good, and I think that God would have better ways of getting to that. Just not create beings that have such primitive selves. How about that? Like, create beings that are more enlightened at the outset. I think that's a better way to go. Now, you might say, well, you're wrong, and this is why it's actually better to strive over primitive selves. But you've got to make that argument. That's got to be part of the argument. If your case for theism depends on these particular specific moral principles, then you need to substantiate those, right? See, my defense of naturalism doesn't depend on this, on say welfareism, for example. I could accept a different view about the grounding of goodness, but it seems like this argument for theism, this particular way of putting things together, is dependent on these sorts of principles, or like on this particular way of understanding goodness, and therefore they do need to give that sort of defense, in my view.
Understanding of moral concepts.
You can skip forward a bit, I think.
Kind of being a kind of empirical scientist of his own.
Yeah, so this is a similar point here. Okay, so there are mathematical, logical, and scientific truths we're able to discover. Okay, yes, I agree with that. That's the fact that allegedly theism can explain. How does it explain that? Well, because humans have the ability to do it. Yeah, but I mean, but why would God create a universe such that is true? What's the connection there? Let's see what he says.
Applying the rationalist kind of understanding and truths about the world into observations, right? And so humans are actually able to have this ability to discern truths about the world. We're actually able to apprehend and actually gain knowledge. And so we can explain the applicability of mathematics and logic within the realm of reason, right? But the realm of reason is the alethic domain. And so this fits in our taxonomized understanding of our axiological domains. And it makes sense of reality that is fundamentally rational rather than irrational, right? And so if reality is fundamentally rational, relating to truth, then we should observe truth. And so ontological arguments can fit into this. We think.
Sorry, what did he say there?
And it makes sense of reality that is fundamentally rational rather than irrational, right? And so if reality is fundamentally rational, relating to truth, then we should observe truth. And so
if reality is fundamentally rational, relating to truth, which isn't what rational means, by the way, then we should observe truth. Is it possible to observe falsity? What could that possibly mean? Observe falsity as opposed to truth. I mean, you can observe wrongly, right? You can make a mistake, but that's clearly not what he's saying. Although I'm not really sure what he is saying now that I think about it. I can't even begin to conceive of what it would mean for there to be any kind of reality in which truth didn't exist, in which there weren't things that were the case and things that weren't the case. I don't know, maybe some sort of ultimately chaotic omniverse where everything simultaneously does and does not exist. I don't know, like, that's outside my pay grade, at least. I'm going to say that any kind of conceivable reality has things that are and things that aren't, and that's just what I mean by truth, right? And so we don't need to explain why there is truth. Like, it's just bizarre sort of requirement here. Now, as to the rationality, rationality is an entirely different beast from truth. I don't know why these are being conflated here. It's hard to define rationality, and it's a contested thing. And there's different forms of rationality. If we're talking about like epistemic rationality, which seems to be relevant here, then rationality would be like a process for justifying one's beliefs, or for arriving at beliefs that are more likely to be true or justified or something like that. So this is an agent relative conception, right? You don't just have rationality that sort of exists, I don't know, out there. Agents are rational as they agents capable of thought to a sufficient level, you can argue what level that is, are capable of thinking rationally or irrationally, or to varying degrees, right? You can also say an argument is rational or irrational to the extent that it respects certain rules of inference and logic and such. That's what's meant by rationality. Now, again, I don't know that there is much of an explanation needed for that, because, I mean, any world in which there are beliefs that are more or less well supported by evidence, let's just say, without saying exactly what evidence is, I mean, any world like that's going to have rationality. Maybe even the laws could work differently. At least some of them could work differently than in our world. You know, maybe there's universes in which principles of quantum mechanics are more relevant to everyday logical reasoning or something. I don't know. I'm just sort of making it up. But the point is, you know, there's got to be some sort of principles differentiating better from worse inferences, right, in terms of arriving at the truth or something like that. I don't know. Again, I'm not sure what we're trying to explain here. Again, the datum just seems to be that there are mathematical, logical, and scientific truths, but all that means is that there are facts about maths and logic. Well, those are metaphysically necessary, so those don't need an explanation. As for scientific truths, well, those are just facts about the material world. So as long as there's a material world, there's going to be some kind of scientific truth about it, even if it's very different to current scientific truths. So the fact that there are truths, to me, just doesn't really need any explanation, I guess, unless you're going to ask, well, why is there a world at all? We've kind of talked about that already. The second part is that they are discoverable via the scientific and philosophical method. Now, this is an interesting point. So how discoverable do we think scientific laws should be under theism versus under naturalism? I think what we need there is an explanation as to why we would expect scientific laws to be discoverable under theism, and why they're not more discoverable. Like, why are they this amount discoverable? Because there's a lot of science that we don't understand. Maybe we'll discover it later, I suppose. It's a bit hard to say. But an example I'd like to give is quantum chemistry, right? So, you know, we have a framework for explaining and predicting in very precise detail the energy levels of an electron surrounding a single atom, so like a hydrogen atom. And you can actually use that model as well for explaining the energy levels of an electron surrounding a nucleus with multiple protons in it. So this would be like 2 protons would be like a helium ion, and so forth, right? As long as there's one electron, you can actually solve it quite readily. It's pretty easy to do. As soon as you introduce even a second electron, there is no closed form solution. And in order to even approximate the energy levels and other electronic properties of a 2-electron or more than that electron system, we have to use an excruciatingly complex series of approximations, which cannot be solved but can be approximated numerically. And, you know, in some sort of series limit of doing enough iterations of the approximation, then we can get reasonably good numerical approximations. I did a podcast episode on this for anyone who's interested in computational chemistry. I think it's quite interesting because even a very simple system like a helium atom, completely intractable, it cannot be solved in a closed form, like with a relatively simple equation. And even the numerical approximations are really obscenely difficult. like if you know, if I went to heaven, I would complain to God, like, why couldn't you make it easier for us to solve for the energy levels of a helium atom? Like, it's unreasonably difficult, God, come on. So you could say that in a sense, we've discovered scientifically how to do that, but really we've like painstakingly kludged together a bunch of different assumptions and approximations that allow us to just get like reasonably decent approximations here. We need a lot of computing power to even model very simple molecules, let alone really complicated ones like proteins. We're not even close to being able to do that in, at least at the highest detail of ab initio quantum calculations. So when people tell me that it's amazing how discoverable the world is through the scientific method, I immediately think, I don't know, I'm not very impressed with how discoverable it is. I mean, I just gave one example, but there are all sorts of things that are extremely undiscoverable. Maybe we'll figure it out later, but maybe not, right? All sorts of things that are extremely complicated and unreasonably hard to determine. Now, you could say, well, this is exactly what we'd expect. We'd expect it to be somewhat discoverable, but not completely discoverable, because, we don't want us to think we're gods and we can, know everything. But this is what I mean. Like, it's all just hand waving ad hoc. How discoverable do you expect it to be? And why is that how much you would expect it to be? I don't know how discoverable we would expect under naturalism. I would assume that it's a little bit discoverable, but a lot not discoverable as well. Like, I don't really know how to even assess that. But the point is, my naturalism doesn't depend on me being able to provide an argument for how discoverable I think the universe is. That's really no part of why I'm a naturalist. But if that's crucial to your defending theism as to why you're a theist, to be able to give some sort of articulation as to why it is that we would expect this amount of discoverability, then you kind of have to have an answer for this. Otherwise, it's just hot air from my point of view. It's like, well, I mean, yeah, it's somewhat discoverable, but is that how much discoverable you would expect? I mean, how would we even know that? Again, I don't see the substance here. It all just seems to, as soon as you, like, it sounds okay if you talk, oh, discoverable, yeah, I guess, and God's rational. But as soon as you sort of zoom in, why exactly would God want to make a universe discoverable? What does that have to do with anything? Why would it be discoverable to us? Maybe there's angels who are like way smarter than us whom it's discoverable to, but he didn't make up, like, we're supposed to reflect different aspects of God's nature, right? So why are we the discoverability part? Maybe that's some other bit of the universe. Like, there's so many things you could go into here that just sort of ignored here and brushed under the rug. This is why theism is a bad explanation, folks, is because they never are able to fill in these details. It's all extremely vague and sort of hot air when you try to get to the details of it, like we're trying to do here. Why is it that we would expect anyone to be able to understand the universe? Why does God even want that? What does that have to do with anything? Why is it that we specifically would be able to understand the universe and not some other part of the universe or some other being or whatever that God created? Why is it that it would be this amount of discoverable and not more or less discoverable? How do we, like, what timeline are we talking about? Because we've only recently invented science, right? Like, there's so many questions you can ask here. The theist is never going to have an explanation to any of these things because it's all ad hoc. And that's why it's a bad explanation. Theism is a bad explanation.
So ontological arguments can fit into this. We think about and have always recognized that you can go to it also vast in the world as a whole, a sufficiently large amount of aesthetic beauty and wonder. Human beings have always recognized that there is an aesthetic impulse that we have in us to look at.
Discoverability is finely tuned for a mild frustration. Yeah, it almost seems like that. Like, we can know enough to sort of glimpse what we would like, but then we can never achieve what we grasp for. If anything, I think that these sorts of things are arguments for a sadistic God, right? The idea that we're kind of on the balance between some but not enough. It's like we're constantly feeling unsatisfied. This is the Buddhist take, right? Not that the universe is created by a sadistic God, but everything is sort of unsatisfactory. Well, maybe that's what you'd expect if a sadistic God made everything. I don't know. Food for thought.
The universe this way, and the universe is very holistic in how it functions. Its patterns and its uniqueness and its representations of such actually do fit into different normative theories of aesthetics. I think you have
patterns of the universe fit into normative theories of aesthetics. Yeah, okay. Most of the universe is just complete black emptiness, at least as far as humans, like the observation of humans. I mean, there's, technically there is atoms there and dust and so forth, but like it's mostly empty. I don't know. That's not so beautiful for me. Yeah. If I was in charge of making the universe, I tell you, I would put some more interesting stuff there.
I forget what the theories are exactly called. But I think
we don't need to get into that, Tim.
No, it's fine. I'm not going to. But I'm saying that if somebody's worried about whether or not this is exclusively fits only in one way of viewing aesthetics, actually it works with all of them. So it's actually consistent across the board. Aesthetics are.
Oh, it works for all of them. You heard it here, folks. It works with all theories of aesthetics. I can't speak to that because I don't really know anything about aesthetics, but yeah, okay.
Consistent across the board. And so, for example, we can view our fine-tuned cosmos as evidence for an orderly world. An orderly world fits in the aesthetic domain. The vastness of the universe speaks to its aesthetics, as well as the universe.
Why does the vastness of the universe speak to its aesthetics? Why is it good for the universe to be big? If the universe was half its size, would that speak to its aesthetics? What about a tenth of its size? What about 1,000,000 times its current size? Do you see the issue here, right? Theism has no explanatory power. Because any size that the universe was, the theist could say, oh, its size speaks to its aesthetics, which points to God. It doesn't matter what size the universe is because there's no principle to hang on that says we would expect the universe to be this big, regardless of how empty the universe was, regardless of what was in the universe. How many? Black holes are kind of horrifying things. I personally don't find them beautiful. I find them kind of bizarre, weird, and scary. And a lot of the universe is black holes. A lot of it's dark matter. We don't even know what that is, let alone dark energy. Like, how is any of this stuff beautiful? I mean, you could say, well, it's all subjective anyway, but really, like, who finds dark energy beautiful? Like, come on. Like, most of the universe is stuff we do not understand. This seems to fit much better with the sort of Lovecraftian cosmic horror idea of the universe, which is certainly not beautiful. I mean, there's maybe some aesthetic enjoyment there, but beauty is not quite the right word, right? So again, I don't get it. Where's the explanatory value here? What are we predicting or even retrodicting? Like, what is it that we expect based on the stipulated properties that we talked about before, the omnipotence trope and all that? Why does that lead us to expect that the universe has a certain amount of order and a certain size and a certain amount of stuff in it and so forth? There's nothing. It's just all hot air and hand waving. It would be more aesthetically pleasing to brutalists if some planets were angled blocks of concrete. Yes, and historically, many philosophers, at least in the Greek world, said that the planets would orbit they thought it orbited the Earth, but that they orbited in perfect circles because that was the most beautiful and perfect shape. There was this crystalline spheres that orbited, orbited's maybe not the right word, that circled about the Earth. That was partly based on aesthetic principles, right? Now, that all turned out to be wrong. So can we really trust any of these sorts of vague appeals to aesthetic judgment? I think it's all a bit nonsense.
Evolving over time.
Okay, that's enough on that.
Exterior odds. What that basically means.
This is just the same. I'm happy with this framework, right? It's just everything that they're chucking into the equation, I think, is nonsense, or not, at the best, not properly explained. Let's move past that. Okay, so I mean that's it about in terms of theistic explanation. So I think the aesthetic part was clearly the weakest because there was literally just like nothing there. Like the explainability part is just not clear what we're trying to explain here. How discoverable is things and why do we expect it to be this amount of discoverable? Like, I really don't know. We're not told. The moral domain, why are these things good making? And why do we expect God to make a universe that has these good making aspects instead of others? Because there's many things that could potentially be good making, right? I mean, why these particular things? Why doesn't God just make a bunch of people or beings, angels, whatever, just it's enjoying eternal bliss in heaven and worshiping him or whatever? Like, you can imagine all sorts of things, right? Electrons in love, that's a classic example. Fundamental particles that have these experiences. Fill the universe with those. Like, imagine all this stuff. Why don't we expect those? The theists don't have any explanations for these things. All they have is a very complicated sounding appeal to these, Bayesian inference and objective, what was it again? Explanationism and things like that. But then when it comes to actually cashing it out in terms of concrete things that theism can account for, they don't have anything. This is my fundamental point. It's not really the framework that's lacking. It's the specifics. This is why I think theists like to talk about frameworks. And I'm talking here about things like, the fine-tuning argument or cosmological argument or resurrection. They love to talk about the frameworks that the evidence fits in and, Bayesian analysis and evaluating explanations and the things like this. So you think about, no, never mind, I can't remember that example. But I think that part of that is because, they can talk about frameworks until the cows come home, and that's fine. But when the rubber hits the road and you're actually asked to flesh it out, they don't have anything. They just have vague appeals to, the universe is beautiful and we can understand things. And, look, there's order and, look, moral stuff. And then somehow this is an explanation. We're not told, okay, here are the principles that we start with. And here's how we can reasonably infer from that we would expect God to do this. And that would lead us to this sort of prediction about the way the universe is. And that's consistent. But this is what I would want to see, right? This is how kind of good scientific, historical, and I would even argue a good philosophical explanation works. It fits things together reasonably neatly. Not saying it has to be perfectly precise, but it has to have something. It has to have some structure about here's what we expect, here's what we wouldn't expect, and theism just can't deliver that, in my opinion.
You have,
and I think that we haven't seen anything different here. It's just more of the same. Okay, I'll look at some objections and then we'll finish up. So this is an issue that I've mentioned many times. Theism can't explain anything because of God's omnipotence, because God can do anything. So how do we specify what he would do? So let's see what they have to say about that.
So there are three critical problems with this objection. So the first one is just pretty obvious, that it ignores the fact that God is motivated by his goodness, right? So God is not motivated by his powers or abilities, but rather theism makes its predictions off of his goodness rather than his omnipotence, right? And if you view God in terms of a trope, well, that's also going to sort of bypass the issue, because God's omnipotence is going to be identically related to his goodness. So God is goodness. So therefore, God's going to act by goodness. It's just sort of not entailed, but there's an identity relation between them, right?
Yeah, so the issue here is not that God's omnipotence itself is the problem. It's that there's no substance to the claim that God is omnibenevolent. So you need to add, this is what I always say, you need to add some further theory to explain what sort of things are good such that God would bring those about. Otherwise, we have no framework. If you just say God is goodness, well, what does that mean? Like, what is it for God to be all good? Does that mean he just sits in his own awesomeness forever and never does anything? Because that, like, if that's one view, another view is he creates this or he creates that. There are some people who say that God could create anything he wanted, like extreme forms of theological voluntarism. Others say he's restricted by his nature in some way. Like, you got to put meat on the bones. What is it specifically that grounds God's goodness? Well, I guess they say it doesn't have grounding outside of God itself, but like, what does it mean to say that God's good, and what does that manifest in? You got to tell us something more about it. Otherwise, you can't make any predictions from it. So this is the problem. I also have a real issue with this word motivation here, because God is supposed to be God is supposed to be an omnibenevolence trope. Do omnibenevolence tropes have motivations? If you're a theistic personalist, you say that God is a person. I mean, a different sort of person, but a person nonetheless. I mean, even then I have issues with using a term like motivation, because there's an issue about, well, that's a term from folk psychology. Folk psychology is highly suspect. It's not even clear how to deploy that with respect to human beings, but can we deploy it at all with respect to God? Don't know. But that's even if you're a theistic personalist and you think that God is like a disembodied person. If you think that God is the omnipotence trope, does an omnipotence trope have motivations? I mean, I guess he does. He does. But like, how? Why? Why is it motivated to do anything? I've always maintained that a motivation presupposes a lack, which is what the motivation does. It connects a current state, which is evaluated as unsatisfactory in some sense, to an action which modifies that state by bringing about something, or at least leading down the step of bringing about something that rectifies that lack. I don't think you can make sense of motivations if there is no lack, like if everything is fully satisfied, and that's true for God, right? So I don't think God can have any motivations. It doesn't make any sense to me. You say, well, God's motivated to do good things. Well, he's already perfectly good. It's not like the universe gets better when God does something. God's supposed to be perfect. Not only is he perfectly good, he is goodness. So how can he be motivated to do something else good? I guess that gets to the, what was it again? The diffusiveness principle. But as I said, that was under motivated and not really explained clearly. But anyway, so the point is here that I don't think God can have any motivations, but even if God can, you still need to explain what those motivations are for us to have any predictions. You can't just say, well, God's motivated by his goodness. Therefore what? Like, what follows from that? That's where the rubber hits the road. What follows from that? We need a theory that connects God's goodness and his motivating to do good things with specific actions, or at least general classes of actions that are reasonably constrained. And we just don't have that, in my opinion.
Right. So we could still model, and on the next slide when we have a sort of diagram for this, but yeah, that's sort of the first problem with the objection. But the second problem is for the objection is that it actually, so there's a thought experiment. I'm not going to mention any names that we got from a philosopher, and this is what sort of he told us. So it ignores that even if you have infinite possibilities, you can still put an epistemic probability that is non-zero. So let's say that you were throwing a dart with.
Maybe I'm just too small-brained, but this point strikes me as being absurdly facile. So the argument here isn't that the probability that God will take any action is, let me rephrase that. The argument is not that it is impossible that God would take any particular action because he has an infinite range of actions available to him. The argument is simply that there is no rational basis for asserting that one action would be more expected than another, absent further theory, which is all I'm saying. You need to give a further theory, and so that's going to complicate the explanation. What it seems to be saying here is that, well, any point on like a board of a coordinate plane has zero measure, which means that the probability of that of a dart hitting that, if it's a infinitesimal point on the dart, the probability of it hitting that is actually 0. It's identically 0. Yet it is guaranteed that the dart will hit somewhere on the board. That's true, but it's just entirely irrelevant to the point. So, first of all, events that have 0 probability can occur, right? This is the idea of zero measure, the way that probability is defined. Probability in the traditional axiomatization of probability, the probability is a measure, so it's a way of specifying a size to a set. So a set is like the events that you're interested in, and then you assign a number to that between 0 and 1, which is the probability. So the measure of a set can be 0 even if the set has things in it. So that is, there could be events that happen, but the size of that set of events is so small in relation to the overall space. Like basically, if there's 3 events in your set that you're considering, but the overall size of the space is infinite, then that subset has a measure of 0 relative to that larger space, effectively. Simplifying it a bit there, but the point is that, yes, events with 0 probability can actually happen, which is a bit of an interesting idea, but that's just entirely irrelevant to the point here. The point is, what is the probability that God would do this instead of something else, given the postulates that you've given me? And if the answer is that any particular action that he takes has a measure of 0, that it's not good enough to just say, well, he has to do something. But that's the whole point. We have no explanation as to why he chooses one action over the other. So this isn't a counter. This is just a restatement of the objection. Yes, absent any theory to distinguish why God would prefer one action over another, they all have 0 measure. And so they're all equally likely and equally unlikely. It's not enough to respond, well, he has to do something. Right? Well, yeah, and so anything he does is arbitrary and is just as improbable as anything else. And so you have no explanation. This is just the objection restated in a weird and unnecessarily confusing way. And I mean, 3 is the same point as well. Like, what? The problem is not that God can't choose randomly. I mean, the problem is that if God's choosing randomly, you don't have a theory. That's the whole point. The point is you can't explain anything because you don't know why God would do this instead of that. It's not that God literally couldn't do something because he couldn't choose randomly or events with 0 measure can't happen. The probability 0 can't happen. The problem is you don't have an explanation of them. And therefore your theory falls apart if you're trying to say that God is a better explanation. And it seems to me that 2 and 3 here are just restating the objection in a sort of a weird way. And again, 1 is, I would say, true, but kind of beside the point, because in order to get any predictions out of omnibenevolence, you need to give a theory that connects omnibenevolence with some specific actions. Otherwise, you have no theory. All right, let's move on from that one. So I just not good responses, in my opinion. Because I think that the point here is that they're trying to say that they don't have to say precisely what God would do, but they can say, look, he's going to do something inside the valuable space and not something in the disvaluable space. But again, this is all framework. Yes, I understand that. I'm not saying you need to say precisely what God would do. No explanation is going to be that precise, but you have to give a general framework. In your general framework has to explain, has to constrain the possibility space reasonably enough so that there's explanatory power there. And it just doesn't. Like, we just haven't got anything. So it doesn't matter that in theory you could do it. Like, what's the theory? Like, put some meat on the bones. I mean, and they just haven't.
And then the second objection is that simply that if we have axiology as our background knowledge, then this decreases the prior probability of theism because it requires additional claims about value states, right? So this is an objection. I haven't really seen any philosophers make this objection, but I have seen people online make this objection. And the basic...
Yeah, so I make this objection. I didn't phrase it in exactly this way. But I mean, I think it's sort of an obvious point. The more claims that you add, the lower that epistemic prior probability gets, because you're making more claims, right? I mean, this shouldn't really be a controversial point in my opinion, but somehow it is. So this is why earlier on, at the very start of the video, I was playing that stuff about explanationism and so forth, because it comes back here, and I think that this is relevant. Because if they could get around this point about axiology decreasing priors, basically it means that they can, well, at least it seems to be, what they want to do is they just want to be able to shove in as many claims relating to axiology and like God's goodness and what he would do and so forth. They want to be able to shove in as much as they possibly can without having to bear any kind of cost in terms of plausibility. If they can do that, then they can get really whatever prediction they want out of it, because they can just say, well, God would do this and God would do that, and he has a disposition to do that and he has a reason to do that. And I could say, well, hang on, you're making your explanation more complicated by adding all of these extra postulates in. And then they're going to say, no, we can just sort of do that for free, right? Because it doesn't matter how many extra claims you make. Now, I think that's just obviously nonsense. and no philosopher would be taken seriously who just adds all these claims without justifying them on the basis that it doesn't matter how many postulates they make. But that seems to be what they want to do here. And so how do they justify that? Well, I guess I'll play
The idea here is like, don't we have to assume that there are value states? So we have to like have an additional theory about value states before we can proceed to talk about, what theism predicts or what theism explains. So there are three sort of problems, I would say, with this objection. So the first one is that, well, it simply just assumes an orthodox view of Bayesianism, so even ignoring the other two problems, is that on explanationism, the intrinsic probability is not determined by the number of claims or modesty a hypothesis makes, but rather the intrinsic probability of the world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains and how well they are able to explain all the other propositions that the world contains. So on explanationism, the simplest worldview, the simplest, let's say, theory that has the less claims or is not going to be the most probable one. In fact, Nevin Klimhanga, he actually has an unpublished paper called Are Simpler Worlds More Probable? And in that paper, he kind of shows why probabilistically, like, just because your hypothesis has less claims does not mean that it's more probable, right? So you have to, like, actually, if you want to show that your theory is more probable, you're going to have to filter it through the lenses of explanationism, right? So that's sort of the first.
Now, I don't know what... Responding to explanations by citing papers, responding to objections by citing papers where someone argues this is something I absolutely hate. I mean, if it's a specific empirical finding, I think that's okay, but it's just like, well, someone argues this in a paper, so that's my that's not a response, is it? That's saying you have to read this, not actually answering the question. But anyway, more to the point. So I don't know what that paper says. I haven't looked it up, but let me say here what I think is going on. I think what's being confused here is the notion of a highest level hypothesis. So I think that amounts to sort of the fundamental postulates that are being made. So obviously it doesn't matter how many claims your explanation contains if some of those claims are derived from others, because those come for free. Right? If I say A, and then I also say B, I can get A and B for free. I can also get A or B for free, right? Because those just follow from those two claims. Actually, A or B follows from either of those claims. But so, I mean, yeah, that's not controversial and is very obvious. I don't know if that's what he was talking about in terms of this paper that he mentioned. Maybe it was, but it seems to me that that's the only sense you can say that it doesn't matter the number of claims. It doesn't matter how many sort of fundamental postulates. Sorry, it doesn't matter how many total claims your theory has. What matters is how many sort of fundamental, let's say, axioms or postulates that it has. Now, that absolutely does matter, because epistemically, if you think that those are, think of it this way, if those postulates are, one can be derived from the other, well, that means that then that it's not fundamental, right? So we're not counting those. But if they can't be derived from the other, then they are, at least to some degree, independent of each other, at least epistemically. Like, as far as we know, you could have one postulate, but not the other postulate, right? And therefore, if postulates are epistemically separable, like independent from each other, then they could each be wrong independently of each other. And therefore, the more of them that you add, the more chance there is that at least one of them is wrong. This is a fairly basic point, right? That the more that you add separate postulates to a theory that are, as far as you know, possible of being wrong, the less likely that the combination of them is all correct. And if you need the combination of them to all be correct in order for your explanation to work, then your explanation gets more and more brittle, more and more less likely to be correct, the more and more postulates you make. I mean, this is a very basic point. I don't know why this would be being objected to. Maybe, and I will acknowledge this, maybe I've misunderstood what he is saying here, because the appeal to explanationism confuses me a bit, because I don't know how that relates to anything that's being discussed here. I don't think it is in any way dependent on your interpretation of probability. This point about the more separate, epistemically at least, independent postulates or axioms that you introduce, the less likely it is that the conjunction of them is true, and therefore the more likely it is that your explanation is incorrect, because you've introduced more things that could go wrong with it, to put it loosely. So the thing here is that I think this is consistent with what I'm saying. The intrinsic probability is a function of how simple the highest level hypotheses are. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fundamental things that you start with, the things that you postulate that can't be derived from other things. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. But the axiology is one of those, because the axiology, it doesn't seem, is entailed by any of the postulates that were made about God. That's why I'm asking, how do you get from saying that God is omnibenevolent to any particulars about what's in the world? Notice how all of these objections, the responses to all of these objections never talk about any specific observations or arguments. I mean, I guess this video is supposed to be abstract, but that's sort of the problem. These arguments are just almost always abstract, except for, I guess, resurrection ones, which maybe have the opposite problem. But we never get into the details of how is it that a specific observation in the world is predicted or expected under given the postulates made about theism. It's all just, well, under explanationism, the intrinsic probability, blah, blah, blah. And like, yeah, but what does that have to do with the specific theory that you're actually postulating? How is it that the specific claims that you've made entail or give rise like with reasonable expectation to specific phenomena in the world? And if you can't give us an answer there, then I think it's quite reasonable to say, well, then you're just introducing ad hoc additional postulates in order to get there. I don't know that that depends on any particular theory about probability. All right, let's move on.
Issue with his objection is that it ignores the fact that on an explanationist view of Bayesianism, you can't have it where, yeah, even if it is true that we have to make some assumptions about value, that's not relevant to the probability of the hypothesis. Now, the second response I have to this objection is simply that necessary axiological truths, or the axiology we're using, is simply the principles of logic applied to axiological concepts, right? So these are just analytical truths about value. So just as an example, just as it is true to say that no bachelor is married, right? Because that's a contradiction, you can't say that. It's also true to say that, I think the example that so it was a paper about God's creation and morality. One of the examples that he brought up in that paper was it is wrong to punish the innocent, or something like that. And so that is, I would say that was an analytical truth. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to assume a kind of moral realism in order to accept that. You can just say that given this axiological concept, that when you apply the laws of logic to it, that this is kind of just an analytical truth, right? So again, you don't have to assume moral realism because it's not making any claims about stance independent axiology, but rather it's just talking about axiological truths in and of themselves. And then finally, I'd say the third problem.
This is a completely ridiculous objection. So notice that if you take that seriously, if anything that is a necessary truth does not need a justification, then we skip back a little bit. Let me remember where our 118. Then if we skip back to, do you remember this slide? Do you remember how I said that a bunch of these things are going to be necessary truths and so don't need justification? That's going to bite us in the ass here, because these things then aren't explained by theism if they don't have an explanation. And if they aren't explained by theism because they don't need an explanation, then why are they on this list? You can't have it both ways. You can't say my axiology is necessary and therefore doesn't need an explanation, and then on the other hand say theism explains the axiology. What are you doing? That's an obvious inconsistent approach here. I mean, and the other thing is that there seems to be an equivocation here, because the point is not that, yes, many people are going to say that axiological truths are necessary, at least the fundamental ones are. But so the truths about goodness and value we're talking about here, right? So yeah, maybe something like punishing the innocent or something. But the point is that that's not relevant. It doesn't matter whether they are necessary. The question here is epistemic probability. So epistemic probability is entirely independent of whether something is metaphysically necessary. The example that I always give is digits of pi, right? Pi is an irrational number, so it has infinitely many decimal places. We've calculated a lot of those, but we haven't calculated all of them, obviously. And until we calculate the next one, whatever that is, we don't know what it is, right? As far as you know, it could be, any of the number of the digits between 0 and 9 in the decimal representation, obviously. It could be epistemically any of those, but necessarily it can only be one. It's not like that. It's possible that it could be something else. No. There's only one thing it could be. It's just we don't know what it is. Whereas often, at least many people think that there are other types of possibility where events could go different ways. It could rain tomorrow or it might not, right? They're sort of different states of affairs which are both possible. Only one will actually happen, but they're both possible. Or events in the past could have gone differently but didn't. Whereas we don't normally think that, the 100th value of pi could have been different. No. It could only ever and in any way have been what it is. It's just that at some point we didn't know what it is until we calculated it. That's the difference between like metaphysical possibility and epistemic possibility. So things that are epistemically uncertain still need justification, even if they're metaphysically necessary. So it's not enough just to say that, oh, well, axiological truths are necessary, therefore they don't need an explanation. You still need to tell me why it is that I should think that your postulated necessary axiological truths are in fact true, right? Because we don't know, or at least, I mean, that's the whole point, right? Like there's dispute about them. So you have to explain to me what the reasons are for accepting this axiological principle instead of some other, because there's dispute about them. We're not sure. So saying that they're necessary is entirely beside the point. And
Or,
this last point
back-
about confirmational holism is just so dumb. It's basically just an attempt to get a get out of jail free card. Yes, of course, that hypotheses rest on background assumptions, but the more of them that you need, the more of the problem there is for you. Like that doesn't somehow make it good that you have more of these assumptions that you can't justify. I just don't understand how that's in any way a response. Yeah, let's have a look at this.
As valuable is motivation for God to realize.
So here they're responding to the objection is the axiology that they're postulating arbitrary. Now I sort of said this before. Remember they talked about the idea that like it's just good to overcome trials or to overcome negative desires or something like that. I forget the exact phrase that they used. And I said, well, like why think that and what's the justification for that? I wasn't necessarily saying that it was objective. I was just sort of questioning why accept what they're saying, right? But I think that they're trying to respond to that objection.
Value states have a prima facie allure to God. God is motivated to do the good. Now, what's interesting about axiology?
How can value states have a prima facie allure to God? What? Okay, so God exists sans the universe, right? God created the universe, so there has to be a state of existence absent the universe. Maybe not in time, but at least sort of ontologically. God grounds the universe, not the other way around, right? So in that situation, with God sans the universe, like without the universe, the only value states are those internal to God, like God's value. Are we to say that the value of the universe increased when God made something outside of him? How can we make any sense of the idea that value states external to God, like states of affairs external to God, have an allure to God, as if God's like, you know, it's pretty cool being omnipotent and omnibenevolent and all, but it'll be pretty, like, imagine creating this other thing. Like, that would be kind of cool. Like, they have some allure or pull on his motivation. But God's supposed to be omnibenevolent and have all the perfections and whatever. Like, why would anything outside of him have an allure? That doesn't make any sense. Remember what they said before? Anything that God makes has only an partial and imperfect reflection of all of his aspects and perfections and so on. Why would anything that's an imperfect lesser copy have any allure to God? It's sort of like saying you made the perfect movie. It's not a perfect analogy because you could imagine getting bored watching a single movie, but I don't think God can get bored just being with himself, right? Like that wouldn't really make sense. You made the perfect movie. It's so good that you just want to watch it over and over again, and it has all the artistic, virtues you could ever imagine for a movie, and you never want to see any other movie because this movie is so multi-layered and multifaceted that you always get more out of it. You always get more out of it, even on the umpteenth viewing, than you would get out of watching any other film, right? Now, you might say there can't be such a film. Well, I mean, this film is analogous to God, right? So maybe there just can't be an omnibenevolent being. So if that's true, so much the worse for theism. But it's just an analogy, right? Imagine there was such a film. Imagine what it would be like to say that you watching this perfect film would have an allure to watch a different film. Well, why would you have an allure to watch a different film? You're watching the perfect film, the film that is so deep and multi-layered that even an nth repeat viewing of it is better than watching anything else. Why would you ever want to watch anything else? It doesn't really make any sense. You might say, well, God doesn't have to divide his attention. I mean, he can be with himself and he can create something else. But I think it's still the fundamental principle as to why anything outside of himself would have even the slightest allure to God in any way, right? I'm not saying that he has to redirect his attention, although does God have attention? He's supposed to have motivation, which is an aspect of folk psychology, and knowledge is another one. So does he have attention? I mean, this is another thing. Like, what aspects of folk psychology are we supposed to predicate of God? How do we know which ones are we supposed to predicate? It's the whole thing's a mess. Like, I think it's all ad hoc. It's all a giant mess. No one knows what to say. They just know the things that they want to say. But anyways, so I think that this is a ridiculous statement that value states have an allure to God. So there can be value states external to God if God is like omnibenevolent and is not only that, but remember, God is goodness itself. It's not just that he has all of the perfections. He is goodness itself, according to this theory. So value states can have an allure to goodness itself. I mean, what are we even saying there? Like, put some, like, can you give an example? Like what? I think that can't be correct.
Axiology is what's helping us in our discovery of finding what is valuable and what is disvaluable. And so if we're finding a multiplicity of value, that's not because we're cherry picking our theories of value. It's because our theories of value are actually helping us discover what's valuable.
No, but the problem is the things that are alleged to be valuable have not been demonstrated to be valuable. Like I don't mean scientifically demonstrated. Just like give me an argument as to why it is objectively or intrinsically valuable to, overcome, to develop virtues. That's an example they gave, right? Like, why is that something that's valuable? Because I don't think that's like intrinsically valuable. I think well-being is. And so and this is important, right? Because that changes the type of universe you would expect God to create. You wouldn't expect God to create a universe with so much horrible stuff in it if what is valuable is well-being. You'd expect to create a universe with more well-being in it, right? But this is the issue where I keep coming back to. We need to be specific. What specific things are you saying about goodness, and why is it that we should accept those? And then how does that lead to predictions about things that we observe in the world? It's not enough just to say that there are some truths and we can talk about them, but like, what specifically are they that you're postulating, and why are you postulating them? I think that's really the issue here. I just don't see how these responses get at that point. The problem is not that there are any axiological theories. It's that they seem to be picking them on the basis of what suits their argument and not on the basis of anything that's independently motivated. And that seems very ad hoc to me.
Remember, we're able to update our priors, we're able to update our information by discovering things, right? So for example, let's say that you let's say that, this is actually a good example. Let's say that you see or you hear that a woman is in great agony and pain and she's screaming, right? If you just have that context alone, you're saying, wow, this is very disvaluable. This is really bad. What axiology is going to justify this, right? But then if you find out that she's giving birth to her first child, in which she's been I don't know what that has to do with well, there's actually some value states of affairs going on here. Humans have intrinsic value. And then there are other theories.
Oh, okay, we got that. That's actually a specific claim here. Humans have intrinsic value. That's interesting. Why? Well, where does that come under on the axiology? I'm not saying that there's no justification for that, but let's have that discussion, right? Because I wouldn't quite say it that way. I don't think it's humans per se that have intrinsic value. I think that it's certain cognitive capabilities tendency to or ability to develop cognitive capabilities that have intrinsic value. So like a human in a perpetual persistent vegetative state, I don't think has intrinsic value. Indeed, we often allow those people, we declare those people brain dead often because they're basically, there's no person there, right? I mean, you may disagree with that. That isn't the point. Then there's also animals like, well, what about great apes? They actually have quite a lot of cognitive capacities. Not all, but they have some that are shared with humans. So, the point is not to get into that in detail here. The point is that you kind of need to get into that if you're going to defend a claim like humans have intrinsic value, because I don't agree with that. I think member of the species Homo sapiens is not a value maker in and of itself. It's a proxy, and that's very useful, obviously, for legal context. But that's not the same as saying that that's actually what grounds moral status. I don't think that membership of a species grounds moral status. If membership of a species doesn't ground moral status, what does ground moral status, and why is that? Why does that have value-making properties? How do we defend that? It's all about the details of specifically what your axiology is. Because of course, if being a human is what grounds moral status, well, does that, like, God has independent reasons to make human beings? Does God have 2 arms and 2 legs? Like, what does being a human being have to do with God? Like, again, it's just, it seems very unclear. Anyway, the key point here is just that there's no framework here. Sorry, there's a framework. There's nothing to fill in the framework is the problem. It's like, oh, I don't know, if humans have intrinsic value and somehow that's expected under God and something about, God's goodness, whatever. Like, yeah, but can you fill in the blanks, please? Like, that's sort of the point, but that just isn't done.
Of axiology that correspond to the intrinsic value of human beings. And so we have to go back to our explanationist framework.
Hang on, what did he say?
We're able to discover, oh, okay, well, there's actually some value states of affairs going on here. Humans have intrinsic value. And then there are other theories of axiology that correspond to the intrinsic value of human beings. And so we have to go...
Theories of axiology that correspond to the intrinsic value of human beings. I think it must mean like explain or ground the intrinsic value rather than correspond to. I don't know.
Back to our explanationist framework, which is that higher order axiological theories inform us as to what is valuable and what is not. You can't simply start with a neutral understanding. This is going against what's discussed in the philosophy of science literature called theory latedness, that no datum exists apart from a theory, which is
yeah, again, appealing to conformational holism and theory latedness just seem to be excuses for postulating things that are ad hoc. Yeah, sure, you can't evaluate any... Yes, you can't stand outside of any moral framework to give arguments about like the grounds of moral status or whatever, but you still need to have the arguments. Like, just because your observations are theory laden doesn't mean that you don't have observations and that you don't have to justify the theory. It just means that it's assessed in a holistic way. and an integrated sort of back and forth way. So that's not an excuse for not actually having an argument. It just means that there's no sort of, I don't know, view from nowhere where you can start from first principles and bootstrap up. I mean, I agree with that, right? But I mean, sure, that doesn't mean you don't have to have the discussion. It means you absolutely have to have the discussion.
Directly explanatory theory, that's our axiology, and that directly impinges and is conditional upon our observations. And that's what allows us to come up with these probability assignments, right? So if the theist is within their theory can identify consonant axiological justifications for thinking X is viable, going back to this narrative approach of theories, then they can derive predictions in a consistent way, just as we do in evolutionary biology. And so I think that this object,
I'm not entirely sure what he's saying there, but it does sound a lot like he's saying that we just sort of cook the explanation to fit the data. Now, in a sense, that's always what happens in a retrodiction, right? You try to build a theory which best accounts for the data. But the thing is that the explanatory value has to be high, and the complexity has to be low. So you should have few fundamental, like, independent postulates, and you should be able to account for the maximum amount of data possible. You know, it's sort of as simple as that. I mean, in practice, it gets quite difficult and complex, but you want a few postulates and you want to account for a lot with it. The issue here is that the theists seem to need to make a new postulate for every single thing that they want to explain. Why? Because there are no constraints on God, because he's omnipotent. This comes back to that problem that we discussed before. God can do anything. So whenever you say God does this instead of that, to explain that, you have to appeal to some kind of desire or motivation. And well, what are those? Well, they just all seem to be introduced in an ad hoc way for any particular thing. This is why theistic explanations are necessarily, in my view, and characteristically terrible. Because whenever you appeal to something of a finite nature, there are always going to be constraints based on its finitude and its possession of only certain causal powers, that it can only do these things and not these other things. God doesn't have that. And so explanations just don't work on God, essentially, or for God. Because it's like, well, you know, why did God open the door? Well, he wanted to get inside. But he could have got inside without opening the door, because he's God, right? Silly example, but you see the point. Anything that you say, well, God did this because he wanted to achieve that, he could always achieve that without doing this by doing it a different way, unless you can identify a logical impossibility, and I think that some theists are very liberal in attempting to identify those, finding all these sorts of constraints on God. We talked before about how much bureaucracy and red tape there is about being God. Turns out there are all these things you just somehow can't do, because that's actually the only way you can try to get predictions out of God, to constrain him in all of these sorts of ways. But really, God is unconstrained by being omnipotent, and that introduces a fundamental problem of how can you predict anything about him? And trying to say that, well, he'll do things that are good doesn't really help very much unless you can say what those things are. And even then, there's a question about, well, then what specific ways does God like actualize those goods? And you need a lot of postulates to get there, because of the flexibility that you have in the nature of God being omnipotent. And so that's why I think that the theists just need to keep packing in extra postulates. Well, this is good, and this is good, and this is good, and God makes all of these things, because they have different types of goodnesses. That's how they're able to pack in and get so much stuff. But for me, it's all just ad hoc. It's all just trying to squeeze out structure when there isn't any, because that there are no constraints on omnipotence fundamentally. That's the problem, other than logical impossibility. And I just don't know. I don't think that gets you far enough. Yeah, so they talk about the idea that you can parody this by introducing like a stalking horse objection. So instead of axiology, you have some sort of natural disposition to bring about something. So Malpass talks about this, or necessity. Now, I did watch this, but I can't really remember what their response was. I think these are pretty good objections. Do they have a slide on what the response is? Oh, here it is.
The fundamental reality, whatever it is, will have disposition towards that action. It has dispositions towards any kind of action. But in theism, we actually have our selection pressures. We have selection pressures within our theory that we don't actually have to add complexity to actually figure out. And so this diagram really shows that here pretty well. So these other competitors, such as naturalism and such as axiarchism, they can try to parrot a theistic explanation, but given what we know about the diffusiveness principle, given what we know about the plenitude principle, and given what we know about the axiological relevance thesis, it is not actually able to parrot the theistic explanation, where they're actually able to maximize explanation in the same way that the theist is actually able to maximize explanation. So you can go to the next one.
Hang on. Why is fundamental reality axiologically indifferent under naturalism? I think I missed that. That seems to be crucial here.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
There you go. We're good. We're good. Yeah. And so if there's a best action, a best kind of action, right, then it's a probability of 1 that God will do that action. But it's not a probability of 1 on axiarchism.
Yeah, but how can there be a best action, right? For any action that for any state of affairs that God could bring about, there's always a better state of affairs. I mean, this is a standard response to saying, why don't we live in the best possible worlds? Well, because there's always a better one. Are they saying there is a best of all possible worlds and this is it? Actually, I think they do say that, because later on they talk about that a bit more. That's a bit of a tall order to argue that this actually is the best of all possible worlds. I'd be interested to hear what justification there is for that one. And why God couldn't have made anything better than this. But that doesn't even address the point, because then if you have some sort of mysterious disposition for the universe to achieve good state of affairs outside of any God, then, I mean, that would achieve that state of affairs with probability 1 as well. So the hypothesis is just mirrored there. So why does that distinguish the hypothesis?
The fundamental reality, whatever it is, will have disposition towards that action. It has dispositions towards any kind of action. But in theism, we actually have our selection pressures. We have selection pressures within our theory that we don't actually have to add complexity to actually figure out. And so this diagram really shows that here pretty well. So these other competitors, such as naturalism and such as axiarchism, they can try to parrot a theistic explanation, but given what we know about the diffusiveness principle, given what we know about the plenitude principle, and given what we know about the axiological relevance thesis, it is not actually able to parrot the theistic explanation.
No,
where they're actually able to maximize.
It literally doesn't explain why. He just says they can't.
Towards the good. Because, we're good. We're good. Probability of 1 that God will do that action, but it's not a probability of 1 on axiarchism that the fundamental reality, whatever it is, will have disposition towards that action. It has dispositions towards any kind of action. Whatever.
Well, no. The whole point of axiarchism is that the universe has this sort of. I mean, I think 1 and 3 are fairly similar. The idea is that the universe has some kind of dispositions, tendencies of sort of unexplained nature to bring about good states of affairs. So it is. I don't know if it has to be probability 1, but it's at least. You can't say that there's probability 1 that God would take about the best state of affairs, because then he doesn't have freedom, surely. Because to have libertarian freedom, there has to be he could have done otherwise. But you can't say he could have done otherwise when there's a probability 1 that he would do a particular thing. I don't know how you can. I don't know how you can square that circle, unless you're not talking about the libertarian notion of freedom. But that introduced a host of other questions. Yeah, I don't know how you can say that God has a probability of 1 in doing the best possible thing and still say that he is free. That seems to be a big problem to me. But even putting that aside, why can't we just say that in a stalking horse case or an axiological universe, there's a probability 1 that the universe will, at least in the end, bring about the best state of affairs? We can just say that, well, the universe just sort of works that way. He literally doesn't have any reason to lie. He just says it isn't. Now, the text here says something different. It says fundamental reality is axiologically indifferent. I guess that's just restating the assertion, but no. Look, stalking horse objection and 3, like axiarchism, both say that fundamental reality is not axiologically indifferent, that there is an underlying tendency in the world to bring about good states of affairs. Now, I mean, I don't believe that that's true, right? But the point is that these are parity arguments. It doesn't matter whether we agree with them. The point is there's just as much reason to believe them as there is to believe theism. So the parity argument is, look, you can just say that the universe has a tendency to bring about good things. Don't need to introduce God into it. The response is, no, but the universe wouldn't have a fundamental tendency to bring about good things. But the whole point was that that was what was postulated in order to parody the explanation. There just was no response here. Literally, there is no response. The response is no. It's like no you. Okay. I mean, the parody argument is no you, but then the response to it isn't. I don't know. There's just no response there. Okay. Well, what's response?
So the second response is, of course, Sophie's view, where basically you explain by modality and necessity. But I would say that this doesn't help them at all. So
The maximized
that was response to number 1,
Right.
and I think kind of number 3 as well. Axiarchism is very
Sorry.
similar.
We're good. This principle.
But I would say that this doesn't help. So the second response is, of course, Sophie's view, where basically you explain by modality and necessity. But I would say that this doesn't help them at all. So consider the following scenario. Let's say that it is metaphysically necessary that you have laws. So again, say these laws are metaphysically necessary, and that these laws entail that crystals will form, which read out John 3:16. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, like John 3:16 is, let's say, laid out in like multiple languages across different cultures and so on and so forth, right? Now, of course, I would say, and think everyone here would agree, that this would be very strong evidence for Christian theism, even if it is a metaphysical necessity that you have these laws. So even if it's metaphysical necessity that you have laws of nature, which entail that you have crystals which naturally form out to read John 3:16, this would still be very strong epistemic evidence for Christian theism, even if you have some modal explanation for the data, right? So even if you explain by necessities, and even if you use modality, right, it is still going to favor the theist in this case, right?
So this is disputed. There are some people who think that necessary states of affairs can still be explained. I think I'm with Oppie on this one. That seems rather odd to me. It's like saying, what is the explanation for why the I don't know, third digit of pi is third decimal place of pi is 1, 3.141. Why is it a 1? I mean, I don't think there's any reason. It just is, right? I mean, of course, that's a specific example of a necessary truth, and that's a logical necessity, not a metaphysical necessity. So maybe there's a difference there. I don't know. I don't want to make a strong claim there, but I think we need a bit more than just an assertion that metaphysical necessities can still have an explanation, because it's not clear that they can. If you were to tell me that the laws of nature necessitate that John 3:16 appears in crystals, then, well, we have an explanation for it. We don't need to postulate God doing anything. You could say, well, God made the laws of nature. No, but we're not just told that it's physically necessary. It's actually metaphysically necessary. There couldn't be any other way that the laws of nature could be. Well, then why God doesn't have to do anything? I don't see the issue here. This is just like saying that a real example of this is in the actual world. There are some number of pieces of toasts and clouds and so forth that, they kind of look like Jesus or I don't know, Elvis or whatever else, right? But the point is, we have an explanation in terms of the laws of nature that kind of necessitates that there's going to be some number of things that kind of look like Jesus on a toast or in the clouds or whatever. So, sane people don't then think that that's still evidence for the existence of God or Jesus or whatever, because there just isn't anything that needs to be explained there. So, I mean, obviously it would be pretty weird, from our point of view, a universe where John 3:16 was in crystals. But if we lived in that universe, I'm just not really sure that, and we actually knew of that explanation. This is the point. We'd have to, if we didn't know there was a physical explanation, then obviously we probably would think it was evidence for God. But if we knew of that explanation and could understand it properly, then it seems that we would have accounted for why we see John 3:16. I don't know. So at least to me, I'm not persuaded by that response here, because once you've accounted for something through metaphysical necessity, I don't think you need to then postulate some additional explanation. It seems overdetermined then. Now, I know that there are people who dispute that, but I would say that we should push back against that and ask for why there's a need for a further explanation beyond the metaphysical necessity. By the way, if it is the case that metaphysical necessities still require an explanation, then guess what else we can ask for an explanation for? The different aspects of God, of course. So that's going to be a problem. That one's going to bite both ways. Typically, theists attempt to avoid having to give explanations for different aspects of God by saying that they're metaphysically necessary. Well, if necessities can still require explanations, then the theist's going to be in a bit of trouble as well, unless they can try to explain why their necessities don't need explanations, but the hypothetical naturalist ones do. And then, it just looks more and more ad hoc.
We fill in the evidence, right? And this applies, of course, to any evidence that is put within the framework, right? And so I guess the issue here, I guess the fundamental problem with this approach is that modality is completely irrelevant to epistemic probability. So I can grant, for the sake of argument, that yeah, the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary. It's metaphysically necessary they have conscious agents, moral agents, et cetera, right? So if you want to go down the route of this parity method, is that something natural is always neutral with respect to value states. And so when you take into account the axiological relevance thesis, as we went over earlier, this isn't going to help the naturalist either, because if you just say something is natural, well, that's not going to really tell you if that natural thing is going to be disposed to bring about valuable states of affairs, right? So in this case,
so this point just makes no sense to me at all. Because the whole point, I can't be bothered going back. The whole point of this postulate is that the natural is not neutral with respect to value states. And then we're told that you can't postulate that nature is not neutral with respect to value states, because nature is in fact neutral with respect to value states. This is literally the equivalent of saying that you can't be an atheist because God necessarily exists. Like, I mean, I know you think he necessarily exists, but that's not an argument, just asserting that that's what you believe. Yeah, I mean, you might believe that the natural is neutral with respect to value states, but that's not what's been postulated. So you can't use the fact that you think that the natural is neutral with respect to value states as an objection to someone postulating that it isn't neutral with respect to value. It's just, this is the, well, let's just say something kind of response. Like, yeah, you're saying something, but it clearly and obviously just does not respond to the objection. The objection is, let's postulate this. It seems to do what your postulate does. So therefore, certain consequences there. And the response is, but you can't postulate that because it's wrong. Like, obviously you think it's wrong because you disagree with, anyway, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, so I wanting to finish up here. I don't know why 3 needs a different response to 1, because stalking horse and axiarchism seem very similar to me. But I don't know why axiarchism is not a simple explanation and that has to postulate brute items, because can't they just follow the same trope ontology that the theists here articulated? We can say, oh, no, it's this special trope that has different aspects which are numerically identical. Like, they just say exactly the same thing, but it's not God, and it's not God because it has a slightly different set of aspects, for example. I don't know, like, I don't really understand how their framework works very well, so I'm not going to be able to parody it perfectly, but I don't know why that's supposed to be impossible. Axiarchism doesn't tell us the kinds of goods that would come about, but neither does theism. At no point have they justified why we would expect to see moral agents, except by just introducing ad hoc new moral principles, like it is good to overcome like negative dispositions or something. But I mean, why can't we just say black holes are good, and so a universe that makes more black holes is a better one, right? I mean, unless we have further constraints on the nature of the axiological theory, then I don't really see the issue here. Just as much as the theists can postulate certain states of affairs being good, then the parity argument can do that as well. Axiarchism doesn't say that we would be in the best kind of world or that there will be a plenitude of good things. This is where they seem to actually say that we are in the best possible
basically,
world.
If we're just going to say that things exist because it's good for them to exist, well, that doesn't really fit well with our background knowledge about how we explain why things exist, right?
So things exist because it's good for them to exist doesn't fit with our background knowledge. But saying that things exist because the omnipotence trope is exemplified, and that is numerically identical to the omnibenevolence aspect of that trope, and then appealing to those other principles, the beneficence, what was it, the effluescence one, and then the one about multitude of things, and the one about the cosmic mediocrity principle. I know I've not got any of the names right. That's how we explain other things. Come on. Let's be real here. You're deploying inconsistent standards. You know that all of the stuff you said for the last hour and a half about theism is not how we explain other things. Yeah, look, we might use tropes in other contexts, but that's about the only similarity that there is. And now you're worried about saying, well, things exist because it's good for them to exist is a bit of a strange inference. Now we're worried about making strange inferences like that. This is the whole point of this parity argument, by the way, as far as I'm concerned. Saying that things exist because there's a disposition the universe has to bring about good things, and therefore things exist because it's good for them to exist, I think that's a bit silly myself, right? And undermotivated. But it's no more silly or undermotivated than theism. And it's interesting how in responding to axiarchism, you get exactly the same objections that I give against theism. And we're not really told why they're different. We're just asserted that it's different. Because, of course, it has to be different because theism has to be true. Like, theism has to win out explanatorily.
So the second response that we have to the axiarchist view is that it doesn't really tell us the types of goods that are going to come about, right? So you're not going to expect like moral agents, right? And so because of this, because you don't have the same taxonomy as the theist, right? Then it's going to be more ambiguous. So it's not going to have the same kind of explanatory power. And then finally, is that axiarchism doesn't say that we are going to live in the best kind of world, right? Or that there would be a plenitude of good things, right? So because it doesn't have those principles, right? Because axiarchism doesn't entail that we're going to live in the best kind of world, then it's not going to really have the same kind of explanatory power of theism, because I think at least that the best kind of world is going to be a world with a plenitude of good things, right?
This is just a load of nonsense. Obviously, the best kind of world is a world with lots of good things in it. I suppose you could say maybe it's a world with one really good thing in it, but then, like, that just raises more problems for him. But anyway, at least the best world's going to be a world with lots of good in it. But the point is, yeah, that's what axiarchism is saying. Axiarchism is saying the universe is going to bring about the best possible state, or at least a really good possible state. It depends how strong you think it is. That's the point. Their response to this axiarchism argument is just to say no. Like, it's literally just saying no, that postulate is wrong. But the whole point of the postulate is to parody the theist postulate. This is like me responding to them by saying, well, no, you're wrong because God doesn't exist. Obviously, that would not be a good response. What I'm actually responding to is the problems with this, with what they've said and the justification for the different principles and the gaps in logic and so forth. That's what they would need to respond to here, but they're not. They're just saying, well, under axiarchism, we wouldn't have the best of all possible worlds, or like a really good world with lots of good things. But that's what axiarchism is saying. So like you're just rejecting the postulate. I don't get it.
Whereas on axiarchism, you're not going to really expect that. So
why would you not? That's the whole point of axiarchism. It says you would expect that. So why are you saying that we wouldn't?
It's true that the axiarchist is in a better spot than the naturalist. I think ultimately at the end of the day, theism is still going to win.
They also don't explain why the axiarchist is in a better spot than the naturalist, by the way.
The axiarchist. So now next slide. So finally, we are at the understanding.
Okay, I don't care about this last one. Is there anything else I wanted to cover? I think that this might be worth covering, actually. I can't remember if I watched this little bit here, but this might be the closest that we get to actual concrete examples of what I'm talking about. Play this.
So what basically is happening is that the naturalist is pointing out some fact that is a consequence of some precondition. Remember that when we talk about general facts for theism, what we're talking about is these are preconditions, and preconditions are evidence for theism. So consciousness, right, is a precondition for.
DP, I just got here. Did I miss anything that would make it worth watching from the beginning rather than just starting here? Well, you turn up 2 hours and 40 minutes into a stream and ask, is it worth watching anything that went beforehand? Instead of just like the last 10 minutes when I'm finishing up. Why would you think the last 10 minutes is worth watching if the first 2 hours and 40? I'm assuming that was a weird joke, but I just, yeah, that was funny. Anyway, let's keep going.
Moral agents and things of that sort, and rational thought, right? The existence of an orderly complex universe is a precondition for fine-tuning and things of that sort, and anything else that comes about after that, biological evolution, et cetera, and so forth. And so if the precondition itself is more likely on theism, given how we've laid out the framework for modeling theistic evidence, then we actually have to look at things in terms of the outcome space, the total outcome space, not just in terms of one specific strand of data. So for example, let's start with the first one, the moral agent's outcome space. Let's say that the outcome space is just the total space of outcomes, right? If you're flipping a coin and you can write down the total space of outcomes of heads and tails and things of that sort. So it's not a very complicated concept there. So let's say that the total moral agent's outcome space is that you get moral virtue, but then you also get moral evil. The naturalist is going to say, well, because there's moral evil, and God could have created moral agents in such a way where they only have dispositions towards the good, then it's actually much more friendlier to naturalism that we have moral agents that do good and evil, that do horrific moral acts. And so this actually fits much better with naturalism. And so therefore, that's actually evidence for naturalism. Well, then my question for that is, okay, so let's say that I grant you that moral evil disconfirms theism. But we have to look in terms of the total moral agent's outcome space. If the moral agents are evidence for theism, then theism is going to get the greater proportion of the moral agent's outcome space. And so what we have to do is we have to zoom out. We have to look, okay, well, I can still say that naturalism can get some of the moral evil, but it doesn't mean that it gets the overwhelming amount of the entire moral agent's outcome space. That'd be fallacious. Because theism has as its evidence moral agents, then theism is going to get the greater proportion of the moral agent's outcome space, and then we can give a sliver of that to naturalism because it.
Yeah, I remember I did listen to this, and it didn't make sense then. It doesn't make sense now because they don't explain what this space is supposed to represent. Like, what are the axes here? Like, I'm not saying how do you measure it. I'm just asking, what does it mean? Are we talking about the total amount of virtue versus evil manifested by humans in history or something? Are they saying there's more virtue than goods? There's more virtue than evil, and therefore unbalanced, it's more expected under theism? That doesn't really make sense though, but because you have consciousness outcome space. Like, what does that mean? Conscious agents is bigger than the fact that conscious agents are dependent on brains. So overall, it favors theism because that space is bigger. But what does the space represent? You can just declare that, well, theism wins because these aspects of the observation trump the bit that supports atheism. But you got to sort of make that argument. Like, what's the argument that it's bigger? Just showing them being bigger is not an argument. It's not even, it doesn't even, I don't know if this is epistemic weight or it talks about an outcome space, but what is the outcome space? These are two different outcomes. One is whether they are conscious agents at all, and the other is, are those conscious agents dependent on brains? Consciousness outcome space. So I guess this would have to mean all conscious agents, right? And then there's one in which they are not dependent on brains, and then the one in which they are dependent on brains. But we observe ourselves in the bit where they are dependent on brains, And it seems that that's much more expected under naturalism than under theism. But then they're going to say that the overall space is that in which there are no conscious agents at all, and that that's actually where we would expect us to be under naturalism. I don't know. I think that in order for this to make sense, you've got to redraw the diagram. You've got to have like space where there's conscious agents, space where there's conscious agents that are dependent on brains, and then the space where there's no conscious agents. Like those are 3 possibilities, right? Yeah, so conscious agents not dependent on brains, conscious agents dependent on brains, and then no conscious agents. And I think what they would say is that conscious agents is expected under theism, whereas under atheism, you would expect either conscious agents dependent on brains or no conscious agents. And then the question is, well, what's the prior probability of these different space sets? Well, that's going to be a controversial question, which I was saying before, like how do you determine the relative sizes of those spaces? And of course, I would ask the question, why is it that conscious agents are expected under theism? I don't accept that at all. What axiological principle does that follow from? What axiological principle does an order of the universe follow from? Spatial and temporal order outcome space. Isn't that the same thing as an orderly universe? I don't know. This is just a whole load of nonsense. They haven't defined the outcome space clearly. It doesn't make sense as an outcome space because like this should be a subset of this, not a separate one. And they haven't explained why theism has the bigger space than the naturalism one. If I guess they're trying to say, well, it could, but saying that it could isn't equivalent to saying that it is or probably is. So yeah, I think that's enough of that. More on that. All right, let's finish up here with the conclusion. Let's let them make the conclusion, and then we'll end out here. Oh.
We think that modeling theistic evidence in terms of axiology precludes a lot of the naturalistic parodies. And this is, again, a general framework for understanding theism's explanatory power. This is not meant as a decisive cumulative argument for theism, but it's to show how arguments from natural theology, so the arguments that we already do have, can be incorporated into this framework. And when we incorporate into the framework, it actually is immune from certain objections. So in that case, then, theism is a progressive research program, just like naturalism is. And so I don't know if Tim wants to add anything else.
Yeah, it's really good because, if theism is a progressive research program, what it means is that there's actually more discovery to be made. I sometimes see in online circles that certain atheists or skeptics will object that theists don't have any new evidence. They don't have any new arguments. I think it's kind of even weird to say, given that their main argument is from evil, and that's an argument that's been around forever. And I think that ignores the fact that there actually has been a lot of progress in finding more theistic evidence, right? Joshua Shijiwadi, for example, has been coming up and finding strands of evidence.
Yeah, I think this is why I wanted to play this, because that's not what a progressive research program is, at least if we're talking about it in terms of like philosophy of science. Was it Lakatos who came up with the idea of like progressive versus degenerative research programs? The idea is that in science, you don't sort of strictly falsify you don't just falsify a theory in science, because you can always add additional postulates to sort of save the phenomena, to say, well, this prediction turned out false, but that's because there's this other element that we hadn't considered, or we didn't measure this and we didn't control for that. But the idea is that the more of these that you have to add on, and the less success the research program has over time in accounting for new phenomena, then people just sort of get tired of it and they move on and do other things. So that's like a degenerating research program. Whereas a progressive research program is one that is able to successfully account for new phenomena and improve its explanatory reach and scope and so forth over time. And therefore it attracts more people into it and it gets funding and so forth. That's sort of the crude idea here. At least I'm pretty sure that's the sense in which they're talking about a progressive research program. I don't think they mean politically progressive, for example. So in that sense, theism, so that sense of progressive research program has absolutely nothing whatever to do with coming up with arguments in defense of the research program. So there's nothing about a progressive research program or degenerative research program that says you can't come up with more arguments in defense of it. In fact, precisely the characteristic of a degenerative research program is that you keep coming up with more ad hoc explanations to save the theory from falsification. And that's exactly what I see theists have been doing for the past however many 100 years, at least like since Hume or something. They keep coming up with more and more elaborate, intricate justifications for how theism is consistent with evil, or how theism is consistent with various other scientific discoveries or philosophical developments, accounting for the mind and morality and other aspects of the world, and various other philosophical problems that have been raised about like the Trinity and omnipotence and things like that, God and time being another example. There's just more and more and more elaborate attempts to save the phenomena. That is a degenerate research program. I would be interested if theists can name a single phenomena outside of like theology, like a single phenomena in the world that theists have provided a like predictive and highly explanatory explanation of in the past 400 years. Because there aren't any, right? There are zero examples of that. Now, if I say, if I try to give examples of scientific naturalism having been able to provide a predictive, explanatory explanation for some aspect in the world, well, just point to like all of modern science, and not even just science, like, you know, positivistic approaches like social science and history, I would also put in the same category. Maybe even parts of analytic philosophy, because there has been, I think, quite a bit of useful developments in philosophy. And those developments don't just take the form of trying to, like, for example, though there are scholars who study Hume, what we don't see is that analytic philosophy is just devoted to trying to save all of Hume's arguments from like falsification or subsequent developments in philosophy and science. Like, that just isn't how it works, right? You know, we take the good things from Hume and we recognize that he got some things wrong, and he didn't, you know everything that we know now, and didn't have all of the concepts and scientific knowledge that we do now from you know, developments that succeeded his time. That's not how theism works, right? The constant, I mean, you know, I guess there are theologians who do develop truly novel ideas. Well, I was going to say open theism, although I don't actually know if that's probably super old as well. But anyway, the point is that, yeah, maybe there's some theologians who develop some novel understandings of God, but what they don't do is successfully explain anything in the world outside of God, because theism just doesn't have the capability to do that. It's an entirely degenerative research program that explains nothing, has never explained anything outside of, you know, trying to give a theory to account for its own scriptures. Like, that's about the best it can do. Can't explain anything in the world. No one turns to theology or apologetics for answers about anything, except for when they're doubting in their faith, or trying to understand the scriptures or something. It's all purely internal looking. No one turns to this research program for answers about the universe. Okay, young Earth creationists maybe do, but, like, you know, no one takes them seriously. So if we want answers about like real questions in the world, we turn to, you know, science. We turn to what I would say is good analytic philosophy. There's a lot of bad philosophy as well, but whereas all that theology and particularly apologetics has to offer is rehashing ever more sophisticated developments of the same old justifications for why it is that we can reconcile the existence of God with all of the counter evidence that we have, particularly you know, Christian God and all of the beliefs that go along with that. So, you know, I think that theism is just the clearest example of a degenerative research program. And the fact that they're able to come up with ever more sophisticated justifications to avoid falsification is not evidence against that. That's evidence in favor of that contention. If it was a progressive research program, we would find theists making novel discoveries about, you know, other things and coming up with explanations, or even, like, it doesn't even have to be empirical. It could still be novel developments within philosophy. But I just don't think we do. The only things that they come up with are refinements of existing arguments to try to further justify why it is that we can hold on to the existence of God. So I think that that's nonsense. I think that theism is clearly a degenerative research program. And let me just summarize my thoughts on this video as a whole. So the basic approach that they took was to say that God is the omnipotent trope, which has different aspects which are numerically identical with itself. One of those aspects is omnibenevolence, and omnibenevolence in combination with those extra principles. What was one? Like the diffusiveness principle, that it like creates stuff beyond itself for some reason. We weren't really told why or quite what that means. Another one was the, like, what was it? The multifaceted principle. I forget exactly what it was called, where he's not going to create just one or two things, but lots of different things, which are all imperfect reflections of God's goodness. We weren't really explained. We weren't told why God would do that, but apparently he will. And then the third one was what I call the omni-mediocrity principle, that God won't create things that are like really good or the most good things, but he'll just create any old thing that's slightly more good than bad. I don't think any of those principles are very plausible, nor were they really justified, but those in combination with the idea of omnibenevolence are alleged to give rise to predictions, or retrodictions at least, about all sorts of phenomena, like the existence of, you know, embodied minds and order in the universe, and aesthetic value and all sorts of other things. We never really got an explanation as to quite how that works, like how you join the dots between those things. But we were told many times that we do get that under theism. Even though quite a few of those things are actually necessary truths, and we got kind of inconsistent answers as to whether a necessary truth needs an explanation or not. So that's kind of an issue either way. If necessary truths don't need explanations, then at least half of the things that theism allegedly explains in this video then cannot be explained because they don't have an explanation. On the other hand, if metaphysically necessary things do need an explanation or can have an explanation, then perhaps God's attributes or facets or aspects or whatever also need an explanation. So that's an issue if we take that horn of the dilemma. But then other things were just sort of ad hoc postulated, like the idea that humans have intrinsic moral value, like that wasn't really defended. The idea that it's morally good for people to overcome trials and develop virtues, like where did that come from? Why should we accept that? That it's good that the universe is kind of like somewhat understandable scientifically, although like not too understandable, I guess, or that it's good that the universe is big, but like not bigger or smaller. This is what I mean. It's all just hand-wavy ad hoc nonsense because we're not actually given the principles needed to articulate why it is that we would expect to see these particular outcomes instead of something else. So the whole framework, I think, in principle could work if they had anything to appeal to in order to constrain their explanations, but they don't. They've got omnipotence and omnibenevolence. Omnipotence is entirely unconstrained other than by logical necessity, and therefore cannot be used to explain anything, in my view. The only way that you can try to do that is by concocting all of these sorts of restrictions that you think apply to God, the red tape and bureaucracy that I talk about that exists in heaven that prevents God from doing all these sorts of things. Now, they didn't really talk about that in this show, but in other contexts, that's the sort of explanation you get, that God's prevented from doing all these things. And so, he's doing the best he can. That's the only way that you can really get around the problem of omnipotence, is to kind of invent these restrictions that mean that God is perhaps slightly, such that omnipotence isn't what it used to be, let's say, or, it's not as good as you might have thought it would be. But we didn't really get that here. We just sort of got the idea that, well, no, the problem is not with omnipotence. The issue is, well, we pull it out of omnibenevolence. But then the issue is, as I said, you need a theory, like you need an axiological theory. You need a theory about what things are valuable, why they're valuable, and why God makes those particular things. But we didn't get that theory. We didn't get any connection between the particular phenomena that they were trying to explain. And indeed, at one point, we got some kind of half-cocked explanation as to the fact that they shouldn't need to provide such a theory because they can just sort of make as many postulates as they like. That just seems obviously wrong to me. You can't make as many fundamental postulates as you like. The more of them that you make, they're epistemically independent, the less likely that the conjunction of them are true, and therefore the less likely is your explanation is true. They tried to appeal to confirmational holism and theory depends of observation as some sort of way of weaseling out of that, but I don't see how either of those things are a justification for not justifying your underlying postulates and making lots and lots of them to try to save the fact that omnipotence doesn't constrain explanations. So yeah, I think that this video is far more technical than it needs to be. As I said, I don't pretend to understand all of the trope theory stuff that we discussed. I did my best to try to articulate that. And things were rushed that shouldn't have been rushed. But overall, I think that, yeah, that the framework in terms of like Bayesian confirmation and competing explanations, that's fine. I don't have major issues there. The problem is filling out the details. And when it comes to the details, I just think that theism just doesn't cut it. There just aren't good theistic explanations for really anything. Because you can't avoid, I think, that this fundamental problem of how do you constrain an omnipotent entity? Because they can do anything that's logically possible. And short of, I think, drastically reinterpreting what omnipotence is, I don't think that there's a plausible way around that. I mean, the other way around that is just to introduce all of these ad hoc postulates to say, well, God would do this and he would do that and he would do this other thing. And then you don't have a good explanation anymore. All right. So hopefully you found that 3-hour marathon interesting. No, I don't want to do that. There we go. Let me just have a quick look at chat to see if there's anything I wanted to respond to. Oh, hi, Shannon. Nice to see you. Yes, remember to, whoops, omni-bureaucracy. Yeah, remember to pound that like button and the subscribe button and, you know, the comment button and everything like that. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, it sort of comes down to this. If only there were an omnipotent agent who could provide more evidence at any point in time. This comes to the issue about, you know, if we saw John 3:16 written in the stars or something like that, or in crystals or whatever, that would be strong evidence for God. It's rather bizarre to hear theists use that as an argument to say that, well, theism can explain some things, because most of the rest of the time they spend telling us why we shouldn't expect to see such things. But then they use that as a hypothetical to say that if we did see such a thing, then that would be evidence in the favor of God. Well, if that's true, then the absence of such clear and unambiguous evidence, if it were clear and unambiguous, which seems to be evidence against the existence of God. So I don't know how you can have both of those things at the same time. But it seems to me that even things like that wouldn't really be clear evidence for the existence of God, because it's not really clear why God would be in the business of providing evidence like that. I think that perhaps such things could be evidence for some kind of supernatural power, perhaps some powers beyond what we can understand naturally. But it's a big leap from going from that to being evidence in favor of, you know, an omni-being, right? Because those omni properties are the ones that I think cause most of the problems. The idea that there could be a very powerful being, but is still limited and restricted in various ways, is much more plausible, I think, or at least has much greater explanatory resources than the omni-God. Because it's the omnis, particularly omnipotence and omniscience, which really cause the problems here, because they make it impossible to constrain, in my view, or practically impossible, any explanation that you want to give, and therefore you can't appeal to the explanatory success of any particular framework to justify belief in such a being, because there is no explanation possible, because you can't constrain the actions of such a being. So while such a being could exist, we couldn't. I don't think you could have justified belief in such a being, at least not through explanatory type of arguments. You could maybe then try to make purely deductive arguments, but well, those are their own kettle of worms. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. I think I'll leave it there. As usual, we went longer than expected, but I mean, it was a video I've been wanting to do, so I'm glad that we finally got it done. In terms of next videos, so probably the next one on this channel will be the next chapter of my book. I still need to do a few more readings from that, so stay tuned for, I don't know, in a few weeks where I'll get to that. I'm hoping that we can do some more bad apologetics videos on Digital Gnosis's channel soon. I know that we wanted to do one on the argument from psychophysical harmony, so hopefully that will happen at some point, but no immediate plans, so we'll see. Anyway, so thanks for joining me, everyone. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time.